Use those skills to bring these cities under your sway, so that they may develop into commercial and industrial powerhouses. Surely then the bards will sing of mighty Frederick with the red beard, the great Holy Roman Emperor.
Welcome to Benham's Library. The Life of the Infamous Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. Subscribe for more interesting stuff. Frederick Barbarossa is one of the greatest, but also controversial, and even infamous, German rulers of all time. He fought against rivals within the Holy Roman Empire, which was Germany, basically. Also, he fought the Catholic Church. He failed at his attempt of conquering Jerusalem, because he never made it that far, before dying in an accident. But he was powerful enough to have conquered the Holy Land for good. For Christianity and world history today would look totally differently if he would have lived on. Several of the princes turned Barbarossa's attention to a subject of serious importance. Rinaldo's treachery had excited general indignation. The nobles thought themselves dishonored, and their arrival announced a storm. They came in abruptly, their obeisance to the emperor was less respectful than usual, and all glanced angrily upon the minister. "To what do we owe the honor of this unexpected visit?" asked Frederick, as they took their seats. "We have come," replied the Landgrave Louis, "to demand the condign punishment of your Chancellor Rinaldo, who traitorously attacked the Milanese when their envoys, confiding in the sanctity of our word, and with full trust in our honor, were on their way to the court. Your complaints deeply grieve us," said the emperor. "We foresee all the evils which may result from these misunderstandings. But let us be just before all things. My Lord Chancellor, what have you to plead in your defense?" Dassel assumed an air of injured innocence, and in an insinuating tone replied, "The accused should have the right to defend his cause always, and particularly in the present case, where there are many excuses to be urged. My fidelity to your Majesty, and the respect which I have always professed for the nobility of the empire, are in themselves a guarantee for my innocence. May God preserve me from violating a princely word. Had I been aware that the Milanese, although the avowed enemies of the emperor and the empire, had approached our camp with a safeguard, I should not have presumed to attack them. I can only crave my pardon on the ground of ignorance, if such an excuse be in your eyes worthy of acceptance. But, Chancellor, did we not cry, and that too, loudly, that the Italians were under the protection of our word, and that they must not be molested?" "True, my lords, but the fighting had already begun," answered Dassel. "The Milanese hemmed me in on all sides, and I was no longer the aggressor, but in the position of legitimate defense." "Your representations are not sufficient," said the Duke of Bohemia. "Your tongue is more skillful than ours, and you are our superior in all. That is tricky, but your treason must and shall be punished. Are you ready to clear yourself of this stain in single combat?" "Your lordship must be aware," replied Dassel, with a smile, "that the canons of the Church forbid this mode of justification to the Archbishop of Cologne." "Bah!" said the Count. "You are only a layman like us, only a consecration can make you a priest or a bishop. So long as you are not an ecclesiastic, you have no right to shelter yourself behind the privileges of the Church." "My lords," cried the emperor, angrily, "we will not permit this assault upon a man whose honor and veracity are known to us. We declare him absolved from all blame. We are satisfied with his explanations." Rage and mortification were expressed on the faces of the knights. "If your Majesty wishes to shield your Chancellor, we must obey," said Conrad, but as some amends for the outrage, we request that you will release the consuls who were captured despite our word of honor as gentlemen and knights." "It cannot be," answered Barbarossa. "These consuls are the chiefs of the rebellion, the ringleaders of the conspiracy, which, for many years, has been plotting against us. It would be gross folly, on our part, to say
800 years ago in our world. In the Americas, it is the era of the birth of the Inca Empire and the arrival of the Aztecs in the valleys of Mexico. In Japan, clans of samurai "800 years ago in our world." In the Americas, it is the era of the birth of the Inca Empire and the arrival of the Aztecs in the valleys of Mexico. In Japan, clans of samurai are fighting among themselves. China is invaded by Genghis Khan, the ruler of his colossal empire, known for its gunpowder, printed matter and porcelain. His empire now expands westward, threatening the Arab and Christian borders. The area of influence of Islam grows towards India and crosses the border with Christian Europe, while in the centre, the great Saladin has managed to unite the Muslim peoples and reduce the Christian reign of Jerusalem to a narrow coastal strip. It is the Gothic age in Europe and the age of the first universities, of the Crusades, of translations, of development of cities and of the emancipated bourgeoisie. It is now time to open oneself to the world and to change. Two powers struggle to dominate the West, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Germanic Empire and the Pope in Rome. The Emperor Frederick I Redbeard consolidated and expanded a great empire. His son, Richard VI Hohenstaufen, weds Constance, heir of Roger II, King of Sicily of Norman and Arab synthesis, which intimidates the power of the Roman Church. The son of Richard VI and Constance of Sicily, Frederick Hohenstaufen, is born in 1194. Only 3 years later, his father dies, and a year after that, so does Constance. Before dying, she grants full custody of her son to Pope Innocent III, and in so doing, hopes to safeguard the Sicilian inheritance. Frederick grows up almost anonymously on the island of Sicily, in the middle of the Mediterranean trade routes and in a place where people, cultures and religions meet.
Che cosa rappresenta la Sicilia agli inizi del 1200? Rappresenta un'area
What does Sicily represent around 1200?
Le culture, le
It represents an area where various cultures and civilizations are found. Sicily, like Mezzogiorno, is the place where the Latin Germanic, Muslim and Byzantine empires can be found. It is therefore ideal for multiculturalism and diversity. But Sicily has been a meeting place of different cultures for a long time, at least since the beginnings of the Norman Age. At the end of the 11th century, the Normans conquered Sicily, thus connecting it directly to the west, but still maintaining an interest in the Islamic and Byzantine worlds. The closest collaborators with the Norman sovereign, the employees of the royal administrations, were Muslim or Greek, thus already adding a multicultural to the atmosphere of the royal court.
Musulmani o erano greci, e quindi già alla corte dei re normanni c'è un'atmosfera di multiculturalità.
The process of Frederic's education was shaped by German tutors and those assigned by the Pope, and it is very probable that the education he received had Arab influences.
La madre era una normanna siciliana, ma il padre era tedesco, per cui è
Frederick II
Coming up, the truth behind a legend that has captured imaginations for centuries, the mysterious, real Robin Hood. Coming up, the truth behind a legend that has captured imaginations for centuries, the mysterious, real Robin Hood.
He has been the hero of countless stories, novels, and films. Generations have thrilled to his adventures. But who was the superhuman man behind the mask of Robin Hood?
There are many different theories, depending on which part of the country you happen to be in, of who Robin Hood really was and where he originated and where he lived.
Was he really a wronged nobleman and protector of the poor, or was he a lawless marauder operating out of his own selfish interests?
He's vicious. We have stories where he doesn't just kill people, but he chops their heads off.
We know him as an outlaw with a heart, a crusader who robbed from the rich and gave to the poor. The story of Robin Hood that still fascinates us today was first recounted more than 700 years ago. Since the 15th century, historians have tried to unravel the mystery of who and what is behind the legend. Their discoveries so far reveal dark truths about a long-lost world. Join us for The True Story of Robin Hood.
Every year, enthusiasts flock to Nottingham for a medieval pageant, celebrating the city's most famous outlaw, Robin Hood.
This way for the Robin Hood pageant! Robin Hood and his merry men in Lincoln Bridge so gay. Among the Sherwood here in Nottingham today. In Nottingham today. In Nottingham.
They come to watch a reenactment of their hero's life, staged on the same castle grounds where a real Robin Hood was once believed to be held captive. For more than 700 years, tales of Robin Hood's vigilante exploits have thrilled audiences hungry for a people's hero.
It's just such a romantic story. The idea that in a world where the majority are oppressed and someone's prepared to stand up for the majority against the powerful oppressors.
And Robin Hood is the most romantic of heroes. A selfless protector of the poor, an unmatched marksman, and an avenging angel of justice. But is any of this story really true? Was there a man who inspired this powerful legend of the honorable outlaw? Was the real Robin Hood truly concerned about providing for the poor? Was he a man devoted to the worship of the Virgin Mother? Was he a famed archer without rival in Sherwood Forest? Or was he rather a darker character? A lawless villain who waylaid innocent travelers purely to line his own pockets. The Robin Hood legend began in ballads sung by minstrels wandering from medieval tavern to marketplace.
And always went good Robin, both by hideout and by hill, and always slew the king's deer, and dealt with them at his will. And he always slew the king's deer, and dealt with them at his will.
It then evolved over the centuries into a stock tale of drama and adventure, still recounted today in numerous books, television series, and movies. The key to unlocking the mystery of Robin Hood's identity lies buried in the dark, brutal history of medieval England. The Normans, who invade England in 1066 under William the Conqueror, hold the country in a fierce grip of power. This savage repression continues into the reign of King Richard I, otherwise known as King Richard the Lionheart, who ruled at the very end of the 12th century. This is the same period in which the first ballads of Robin Hood are set.
You had, of course, a country that was governed very heavily by the king and his immediate great lords, and the whole system of feudalism which dominated England meant that from top down everyone was liable and loyal to the person above them. And at the bottom of the heap came those who had a fixed place in society and who never expected to move from that fixed place.
To keep the people in their places within the manors, there are a set of rules. They're administered by the people who own 1% of the wealth.
Sheriffs and bailiffs act as the king's officers, meting out severe punishments for anyone caught breaking the law.
Equivalent to a modern-day caution would be that they'd just take all your possessions off you. If you're actually punished in a court, it could be a sentence of imprisonment, or it would be some physical punishment, some amount of time in the stocks, or some form of beating.
The vast majority or cuts own no land, but live as tenant farmers in meager huts on the edge of survival. Meanwhile, the king and courtiers live high on the hog in stately castles.
They lived in an environment which was as comfortable as they could make it. They lived in stone buildings, some of them very, very ornate, richly decorated. These people ate meat, which was relatively unknown for a cotter living in a village. He'd be living mostly on a
Most forests are owned by the king and are strictly patrolled. They exist only for the king's sport. Licenses are required just to collect firewood to help stave off the freezing winters. And those who dare to enter the royal forest with intent to hunt deer and other game put their lives at enormous risk. If caught, they face cruel punishments or even death.
You could lose a thumb and a finger for carrying a bow in the forest. Could have ice put out for stealing a doe. There was no differentiation between killing a buck and killing a man.
Daily life for the oppressed masses is filled with long, back-breaking work. Any yield from the land they farm is immediately confiscated by their lord or the local church. Local sheriffs, in turn, abuse the laws for their own profit.
Those in authority were fairly ruthless about keeping their authority and not too worried about where they got their money from, so they used and abused their powers.
Those people who don't follow the system become outlaws. In England, entire communities of thieves hide out in remote forests, attacking and robbing anyone who crosses their path. Tales of violent encounters with such criminals spread. Many are afraid to venture very far into the forests. The atmosphere is ripe for a savior, someone like Robin Hood. Life for the oppressed masses in the feudal system at the end of the 12th century is a bitter struggle. Most people are incredibly poor and have little to eat. To escape this grim reality, people look for entertainment of some kind. They begin to thrill each other with stories of an infamous outlaw, Robin Hood, who rises up against the all-powerful authorities.
The tales are invariably about someone who lives freely in the greenwood, where it's always spring, makes his own decisions and acts in the way he and his colleagues want to act, a complete contrast to the absolute control of the day-to-day lives of most of the citizens of the country. This gives you one very good reason why the tales would instantly be popular.
The first tales are spread by minstrels, the popular entertainers of the day.
The minstrels had to learn them off by heart and repeat them. Talkings. You see the minstrels starting, "Lithe and listen, gentlemen, be of freeborn blood." You know, you can almost imagine the great lord's hall or the tavern in the town. He's saying, you know, "Be quiet, you know, listen in, hold on. I will you tell a story of a great outlaw. His name is Robin Hood," and instantly you've got the attention.
The first recorded reference to minstrels' tales about Robin Hood is found in William Langland's epic moral poem, Piers Plowman, written in 1377. In this poem, a peasant character named Sloth mentions that he knows the rhymes of Robin Hood even better than he knows the most popular religious text of the entire period.
He makes a statement that a poor man, he doesn't know the Lord's Prayer, but he knows all about the rhymes of Robin Hood.
The Robin Hood rhymes are very possibly on the lips of almost every person at the time Piers Plowman is put to paper, and could well be in existence long before that date. The earliest written document of one of the actual Robin Hood ballads, called Robin Hood and the Monk, is found in a manuscript collection written about 1450.
Robin Hood leaves Sherwood Forest and goes to Mass in St. Mary's. He's recognised by a monk who he's formerly robbed, who reports him to the sheriff. The sheriff turns the guard out. When he leaves St. Mary's, he's literally arrested after a short fight, dragged off to Nottingham Castle, thrown in the dungeons and locked up.
Robin is later rescued from Nottingham Castle in a ruse organised by his henchman, Little John.
Little John was very aggrieved and drew his sword on high. This monk say he would be dead, and mercy loud he cried, and mercy loud he cried.
This ballad is followed by the publication around 1500 of one of the most important ballads, The Jest of Robin Hood. The jest, an Old English word for a story or tale, is probably written 100 years earlier. These printed ballads are tremendously popular. Tales of the superhero Robin Hood are devoured by the public who thirst for more stories of action and adventure.
Most of the work that's done on the ballads to try and trace the evolution of Robin Hood starts from the very first examples of the printed word. Obviously these are very valuable. The Robin Hood ballads are a good example of how popular they were, because they were printing these almost in terms of the quantities they were printing Bibles, which were important to people.
Most of the masses working on the land are unable to read or write and cannot afford to buy the printed rhymes. Those fortunate enough to own their own businesses are the first to take up the written entertainment and perform it to others.
Tradespeople, guildspeople, the well-off, the wealthy, burgesses, there is a market straight away for the printed material.
Many of the key elements of the legend that have survived for over 700 years can be found in these ballads. Robin is an outlaw hiding out with Little John and his merry men in the royal forest. His nemesis is the much-hated Sheriff of Nottingham. Robin's character also bears some of the same fabled traits that have endured to this day.
The outstanding quality in the early ballads shows his piety, his devotion to the Virgin Mary, his love for the king.
But the Robin Hood of the early ballads embodies many qualities that set him firmly apart from the self-sacrificing nobleman so keenly admired today. He has no blue blood of his own, but is instead a yeoman, the lowly servant of a great lord.
He's a yeoman in the sense of a retainer of a great lord. The great lords all had their groups of landless youths who were their retainers, their soldiers, who would fight amongst each other.
Far from being a sober-headed leader of men, the original Robin Hood is rash and impulsive.
He's hot-headed, he jumps into situations where angels would fear to tread. He fights anybody he meets and is invariably defeated.
He frequently comes to blows and revels in the gratuitous violence of an armed encounter.
In one case with Guy of Gisborne, he slices Guy of Gisborne's face with an Irish knife to the point where no one, not even his mother, could recognize his face.
This Robin Hood has no major crusade to provide for the poor or to redistribute the wealth of the evil rich. His main goal is his own survival. In most of the ballads, all proceeds from robbing travelers in the forest stay firmly in Robin Hood's own pocket.
But the jest includes an element at the end on his death, and the very last line of it says, "For he was a good outlaw and did poor men much good." And this is our earliest reference to the idea that Robin Hood was helping the poor. But the only person he actually gives money to in the jest is a poor knight, not an ordinary poor member of society.
As the ballads travel from tavern to marketplace during the 13th and 14th centuries, the legend takes on new shape. The ballads become more romantic to appeal to new audiences. Maid Marian, who is totally absent from the early ballads, suddenly appears as Robin's love interest.
She and Robin only seem to get together in late 15th into the 16th century in this country in the context of May Games. Post-medieval tradition of the May Games, there's the 1st of May, the great celebration of fecundity that you get at the start of the year.
In this same period, Robin sheds his humble social position. In a play written in 1598 for a noble audience, Robin Hood moves up in the world. He's elevated to Robert, Earl of Huntingdon, with his birthplace given as Locksley in South Yorkshire. This identity has remained ever since. By the 19th century, Robin Hood becomes a stock figure of Victorian melodrama and vaudeville, and a favorite character in children's books. Yet the portrayal of the very first Robin Hood, an impulsive yeoman, quick to enter a fight, living on the margins of society, reflects the milieu from which the real man most likely originates. Who, if anyone, could have inspired such a durable legend? Ballads about an adventurous outlaw named Robin Hood are hugely popular with the masses by the end of the 14th century. But who is the real man who inspired these tales? To capture this elusive character, historians must search for a trail of clues that originated more than 700 years ago. Some believe the key to finding the real Robin Hood resides in the geographical references in the ballads which help pinpoint where he may have lived. The area of Barnesdale in South Yorkshire and the city of Nottingham in Nottinghamshire are both mentioned in the earliest ballads. They are only 30 miles apart, but both places are locked in a dispute, each claiming Robin Hood's history for its own. Which of the two regions can rightfully lay claim as the favorite haunt of the real Robin Hood? On the Barnesdale and Yorkshire side, one early ballad first written down in 1475 named Robin Hood and Sir Gisborne actually refers to a Robin Hood of Barnesdale.
My dwelling's in the wood, says Robin, of you I reckon nothing. My name is Robin Hood of Barnesdale, a fellow you have sought. My name is Robin Hood of Barnesdale, a fellow you have long sought.
There's a very, very strong connection in Yorkshire, based around Wakefield, Pontefract, Doncaster, in the place that was then Barnesdale. It's still known as Barnesdale now.
In one of the oldest ballads, The Jest of Robin Hood, which records his life and death, there are repeated descriptions of locations in Barnesdale and other nearby places in Yorkshire.
In The Jest, there is one almost detailed geographical description of an area called the Sales near Doncaster, Wentbridge near Doncaster, and some historians will pinpoint this as saying this is part of the only original story in the entire Robin Hood corpus, and therefore it must reflect an association specifically with that area.
In the same ballad, Robin and his men hide out in the forest of Barnesdale. Robin's death occurs at Kirklees Priory, where he is said to have been murdered.
Robin Hood is traditionally held to have died at Kirklees Priory, which is not far from Wakefield. We then get the tableau of Robin Hood fitting the last arrow to his longbow and shooting out the window and saying to Little John, "Bury me where the arrow falls."
To this day, a tombstone stands in Kirklees, said to mark Robin's final resting place. Yorkshire is also the home to the town of Locksley, thought by many to be the actual birthplace of Robin Hood, who is referred to in the legend as Robin of Locksley. This is more evidence for the people in Yorkshire who passionately claim Robin Hood hails not from Sherwood in Nottinghamshire, but from their home turf. With so many references in the ballads to Yorkshire, could it be that Robin of Sherwood should really be known as the brave outlaw of Barnesdale? Local medieval records describing the danger of this region suggest more tantalizing clues.
There is a 13th century reference to people asking for armed protection to come down going south that road because they knew they were passing through Barnesdale, which had a reputation for being haunted by these brigands, robbers, outlaws.
Yet even with all the connections to Barnesdale and Yorkshire, Nottinghamshire also claims Robin Hood as its own hero. The town of Nottingham and Sherwood Forest are frequently mentioned as major locations for Robin Hood in the ballads. Sometimes both regions are mentioned in the same ballad.
The Jest of Robin Hood, the biggest of all these stories, combines Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire and jumps between the two quite happily.
But even though this ballad mentions Barnesdale, the city of Sherwood often cites it in favor of its own claim to Robin Hood. Its evidence is the discrepancy of distances found in the Jest of Robin Hood. Robin and his men travel swiftly between their hideout in Barnesdale and Nottingham, which in reality is a 30-mile journey, an impossible distance to travel in one day. The band seeks refuge in a royal forest, and no such place exists in Yorkshire.
Barnsdale up in Yorkshire was never a royal forest, and if you look at the stories of Robin Hood, it's always a royal forest he's in. It's the king's deer he's killing all the time, which weakens the Barnsdale Inn in Yorkshire a lot.
Sherwood Forest, by contrast, is very much a royal forest. 19,000 acres of dense oak trees offering deep cover for outlaws to hide out. This giant oak, known as Major Oak, is said to be the actual trysting tree where Robin Hood calls his men to meet. Other locations, such as St. Mary's Church in Nottingham, where Robin prays in the ballad of Robin Hood and the Monk, and the Church of St. Mary's at Edwinstowe, where Robin and Marian are said to have married, all favored the Sherwood Forest location. Robert Henshaw believes he has found evidence which not only rules out Yorkshire, but which places the references to Barnsdale just outside Nottingham.
There's a present-day map of Sherwood Forest that shows you Brimsdale, which is 5 miles north of Nottingham. Walking distance. And this Brimsdale, if you were to look in the Andrew Whitten translation, it's Barnsdale, Brimsdale, Barnsdale are the one and the same place.
The spelling of two different places which sound very similar is now thought to be just a confusion of the same place and may rule out the Yorkshire connection entirely. This may also explain why Robin is able to travel so quickly between Nottingham and Barnsdale in the Jest. Robin's constant association with the Sheriff of Nottingham also ties him strongly to Sherwood Forest.
The ballads and the legends do talk about the Sheriff of Nottingham, so whether Robin Hood was born or grew up in Sherwood or Barnsdale, we certainly know that his activities were within the jurisdiction of the Sheriff of Nottingham.
The Sheriff of Nottingham is able to pursue Robin in Sherwood Forest, but would have no legal powers over him at all if he operated in Barnsdale in Yorkshire. Yet historians and the two regions continue to battle over who really can lay claim to the real Robin Hood. This long-standing rivalry actually helps keep the legend alive. Each side conducts further research and collects evidence, still trying to gain ammunition to destroy the other side.
Isn't it fascinating that you have these local authorities fighting over someone who's a criminal, a murderer, a committer of severe violent deeds, a usurper of authority, you know? And yet we have local authorities fighting over him.
Does the true Robin Hood hail from Nottingham or Yorkshire? Historians have found likely candidates from both locations. Geographical references in the ballads have led the quest for the real Robin Hood in two directions, Nottingham and Yorkshire. Yet other regions in England also lay claim to the great hero.
There are so many theories about who Robin Hood was, where he came from, where he really belongs. There's almost as many theories as there is old ballads.
Since the 15th century, historians have labored to discover if the legend of Robin Hood is actually based on a real man's life. To discover his true identity, historians must become medieval detectives searching for a man who died over 700 years ago. The first historical written reference to a real Robin Hood occurs in 1420 in an historical rhyming chronicle, which places a pair of forest outlaws, Robin Hood and Little John, in Barnsdale, Yorkshire, in the late 13th century between the years of 1283 to 1285.
The earliest surviving chroniclers writing about Robin Hood are Scottish. Remember, nobody says he knew Robin Hood. Nobody recorded the Robin Hood events at the time that Robin Hood lived, you know? But you find a quiverful of Robin Hood stories from the north of Scotland down into Cornwall.
In the History of Greater Britain, written in 1521 by Scotsman John Major, Robin and Little John are now assigned another date, operating at the end of the 12th century from 1193 to 1194. This is during the rule of King Richard I, also known as Richard the Lionheart. These two references, placing Robin either at the very end of the 12th century or towards the latter half of the 13th century, have given historians two general time frames within which to search for a possible real Robin Hood. But tracking down references to any historical person actually named Robin Hood is fraught with difficulty.
The problem you've got is Hood was quite a popular surname, and Robin/Robert was fourth, fifth most popular Christian name in medieval England.
Some historians consider one early candidate from Wakefield, Yorkshire, as the true man upon which the legend is based.
We have one person we know was an outlaw, who was a criminal, who had escaped from the court's jurisdiction, and who was called Robert Hood. And he occurs in the court rolls for the Archbishopric of York in 1225/26 and reappears with the nickname Hobbyhod a year later. And he is the only person we know who could actually fit the bill as a possible origin for the tales.
The records show that on becoming a fugitive, Robert Hodd's possessions are sold for 32 shillings and sixpence. This thief is clever enough to evade the authorities, and no further record of him exists. However, another man called Robert Hood is born in Locksley, Yorkshire in 1290. His life bears many parallels to the character from the ballads.
To have seen how these yeomen fought 2 hours of a summer's day, and neither Guy nor Robin Hood was ready to fly away, was ready to fly away.
As a young man, he commits a vicious murder, recalling the violence of the Robin Hood character in the early ballads. He then commits a string of other offenses, which are documented on the parchment of the local court rolls. In 1322, Robert Hood of Locksley fights in a rebellion against King Edward II. Whereupon he is stripped of his lands and forced to live in poverty with a group of other men seeking subsistence in the nearby forest of Barnesdale. But other historians contend that searching for a real person named Robin Hood is totally the wrong approach.
I think Robin Hood was a nom de plume, a nickname. All the other characters had nicknames. There was Little John, Much the Miller, Will Scholar, all nicknames. Why not Robin Hood?
Local Nottinghamshire historians Jim Lees and Robert Henshaw have spent over 40 years trying to capture the identity of the man behind the legend of Robin Hood. After poring through reams of documents on family pedigrees, they believe they have discovered a less obvious but equally viable candidate.
I believe that it was Robert de Kime, born in Nottingham, outlawed in 1226, as it says in the ballads, pardoned a year later, outlawed again for opposing the king, and died an outlaw.
The de Kime family pedigree is well documented, and they have, like Robin Hood in the legend, a justified claim to the earldom of Huntingdon through ownership of land. Robert de Kime lives from 1210 to 1285, which places him as an active outlaw under the reign of King Edward I.
There's only one reference to the king in the early ballads of Robin Hood, which is Edward. Edward, our comely king. There's various interpretations what the word comely means, but he was king from 1272.
Yet another theory supports the idea that Robin Hood is merely a nickname. A local Nottingham historian claims that an entire family of noblemen, the Folliotts, living in the village of Wellow just outside Nottingham through the late 14th century, uses the pseudonym. The Folliotts, familiar with Robin Hood's great reputation as an outlaw to be feared, assumed the nickname on entering the forest to disguise their true identities and to protect themselves against a lawless society. The mere mention of the name is enough to discourage their enemies. Whether this theory is accurate or not, it is clear from public records that the nickname of Robin Hood is already in use by 1265. There are at least 8 people before 1300 who were given the Robin Hood nickname, at least 5 of whom are outlaws with a criminal record. Far from being an insult for criminals, the name becomes a badge of honor. Would-be outlaws are eager to assume the mantle of the great hero and enhance their own reputations with the infamous name.
In the same way that there were lots of different sheriffs at the time that have been amalgamated into one personality, I think probably the same is true of Robin Hood, and that the name Robin Hood effectively became a nickname of any decent outlaw at the time.
With so many possible theories stretching over 100 years, historians have searched the ballads for clues to try and place Robin Hood in a fixed historical time frame.
There is, within some ballads, mentions of money, marks, shillings, and also the price of some articles. You could use these as a measure, if you like. If a loaf of bread or a pair of shoes cost threepence in 1200 here in Nottingham, if that was specifically mentioned in the ballad, you would say, well, it must have been around the year 1200 because a pair of shoes by 1300 would have cost you sixpence.
Yet so far, these efforts do not yield any concrete evidence to indicate exactly when the real Robin Hood was active. The slew of conflicting evidence points to men who lived not only at different times, but also in different parts of England, some in Yorkshire and some near Nottingham. Some historians speculate that there may have been 2 ballad cycles based on 2 different real Robin Hoods, which later merged to form the modern legend. Will historians ever be able to say with any certainty which of these men is the real Robin Hood? As historians continue to debate who the real Robin Hood may be, local residents in Nottingham are more interested in celebrating the legend of Robin Hood than discovering exactly who he really is.
I think to the people of Nottingham, that's not amazingly important. What's important is that it is accepted fact that Robin Hood hang around Nottingham years ago and fought against the baddies and kept outwitting them, and that the Sheriff of Nottingham, who was a nasty man in those days but isn't now of course, existed also and kept imprisoning Robin Hood.
Participants in the annual Robin Hood pageant help keep the history and artistry of the medieval era alive. Artisans recreate the actual weapons which Robin Hood and his men used to do battle against the Sheriff of Nottingham and his evil deputies.
This would have been made out of yew. There's a distinct difference between the sapwood and the heartwood. When a bow bends on the outside of the bend, it's got to expand. On the inside, it's got to be under compression. So you've got the elasticity of the sapwood on the outside and the strength of the heartwood on the inside of the bend. That was why yew was used.
Skilled craftsmen produce coins in the authentic medieval fashion of the era, the same money that Robin Hood and his men would have stolen.
And the silver penny, like that, was the only coin that was being struck the time of King Richard and King John. For small change, you take a pair of shears, penny shears, and cut. There you have a half penny. Literally how a coin was made, cutting it in half. Further small change will be made, cutting it into fourths to make a fourthling or a farthing, and a coin like that in 11.99 that would have bought you 4 pints of beer.
These crafts illustrate the simple
John. For small change, you take a pair of shears, penny shears, and
side of the bend. That was why you was used.
skilled craftsmen produce coins in the authentic medieval fashion of the era, the same money that Robin Hood and his men would have stolen.
And a silver penny like that was the only coin that was being struck the time of King Richard and King John. For small change, you take a pair of shears, penny shears, and cut. There you have a half penny. Literally how a coin was made, cutting it in half. Further small change will be made, cutting it into fourths to make a fourthling or a farthing, and a coin like that in 11.99 that would have bought you 4 pints of beer.
These crafts illustrate the simplicity of people's lives then, and also show their daily encounters with danger. These arrows are lethal weapons carried by every medieval man.
That's what they use for going through plate armour, chainmail, and anything else that got in the way. That's the only thing in this modern day and age that will go through bulletproof glass.
Just as the medieval arrow cuts through contemporary armor, so does the Robin Hood legend pierce the march of time, bringing the past vividly into focus.
The real excitement for me about these stories is that they are living history. The same stories have been told and retold over 700 years. We have them as a direct link to stories being listened to by people just like us 700 years ago.
For some, a definitive answer about Robin Hood is less important than the thrill of the pursuit.
The best thing about being a Robin Hood enthusiast, I suppose, is the quest.
For every age, Robin Hood has been the symbol of an outcast rising up against oppression. But will we ever manage to capture a real trace of the elusive spirit with any certainty?
I don't think anyone is going to be able to stand up one day and say, aha, I've finally found out the truth. It's more about finding more material for debate, I think.
On the one hand, the ballads have yet to be subjected to the intense scrutiny that other medieval literature has benefited from.
Specialists in English literature have taken the King Arthur stories apart line by line because they're looked on as good literature and therefore worth investing time in. Those Robin Hood stories require the same very detailed analysis by literary specialists to see what we can gain from them. They're evidence sitting there waiting to be got at and not nearly explored enough.
On the other hand, there is still a mountain of evidence for eager historians to inspect.
There are literally tens of thousands of medieval documents still in this country that have not been researched fully. There are more references to be found. More stuff will turn up, but it will turn up by accident.
Whatever new clues may emerge in the case to crack the true identity of Robin Hood, there is at present no consensus on whom the real man is, and new theories are constantly surfacing.
Sometimes a fellow will find, a little gem, a little grain of sand within an old pipe roll or an old reference book, and you will then get a theory. The theory is instantly seized on by any of the local press.
If he was not one man, he was many. A composite character drawn from a rich medieval tapestry of infamous outlaws who refused to succumb to the brutal repression of the day.
There's a big difference between a myth and a legend. A myth is something which is based on nothingness. It comes out of the air, it is invention. A legend, you think there's a good chance that there's something concrete that it all comes from. And it's very difficult for me instinctively not to believe that there's an original, someone whose exploits became so popular and so well known locally that tales were told about them, told around the taverns, and then spread gradually. And I can't help believing, in my romantic way, that somewhere there's a real Robin Hood.
In 1949, the city of Nottingham erected outside its castle a statue of its infamous outlaw. It depicts Robin drawing his bow and arrow. Not surprisingly, the city council constantly has to replace the arrow, which is regularly stolen by local outlaws, maintaining the tradition of Robin's mischievous spirit.
To discover more about Robin Hood and any other topic in history, please use the search engine at historychannel.com.
Coming up, the truth behind a legend that has captured
In Search of History enters a world of adventure, of tales which charmed a sultan for 1,001 nights. Discover the truth behind legendary characters like In Search of History enters a world of adventure, of tales which charmed a sultan for 1,001 nights. Discover the truth behind legendary characters like Aladdin, Sinbad, and Ali Baba. Arabia, a vast stretch of land bridging Europe, Asia, and Africa, eternally isolated by a surrounding sea of sand. As late as the 18th century, little was known in the west of this exotic region until the appearance of a remarkable book. Titled The 1,001 Nights, or the Arabian Nights Entertainments, it was published in Paris in 1704. A translation of an ancient Arabic text, it became one of the best-selling books of the time. Within months of its appearance, its popularity rivaled that of even the Bible. The stories opened a portal into the fabled world of the Middle East 1,000 years earlier. This was a time of wealthy and powerful rulers, a time of magnificent palaces, of desert fortresses, kasbahs, and harems. A time when Arabic culture dominated vast areas of the ancient world.
We're looking at a period which is at astonishing intellectual brilliance, a period when science is moving forward rapidly in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, optics. Almost every field that we think of as science and medicine today are moving forward at a very rapid pace. And we're also talking about a culture which is extremely literate. which is producing an enormous number of books.
The opening pages of the Arabian Nights tell of a mythical king or sultan who was so angered to discover that his wife had been unfaithful to him that he had her put to death. Fearing further sexual betrayals by any of his future wives, the Sultan decided to marry a virgin each day, take his new bride to bed, and then have her beheaded the following morning.
We only have to look at our own history. We know that King Henry VIII did away with, like, how many wives was it? 8, however many concubines besides that. And that was one of the kings of England in what's very close to the modern era.
For years, the carnage of marriage and murder continued. Eventually, few eligible young maidens remained alive in the Sultan's kingdom. The nation's highest government official, the vizier, could no longer find any women to take the deadly marriage vows with the Sultan. All had already succumbed to his bloody decree. All, that is, except one. She was the vizier's own beloved daughter, a beautiful young woman by the name of Scheherazade. With no choice but to remain loyal to his sultan, the vizier reluctantly introduces Scheherazade to him. The sultan willingly accepts his lovely new bride, sealing her fate. It is here that the Arabian Nights surprises its readers with the first of many unexpected turns. For the text reveals that Scheherazade devises a plan that may save her life. After hours of passionate lovemaking, Scheherazade playfully asks the Sultan if he would like to hear a story. Always ready for a little diversionary entertainment, he agrees. And so Scheherazade begins to weave her spell. She starts to tell him a fable of high adventure and intrigue. By sunrise, the Sultan is still engrossed in the tale. Scheherazade has captured his unremitting attention. Clearly, she is a uniquely gifted storyteller. But with the dawn must come her fate. In accordance with the Sultan's decree, she must now die. Yet it is at this crucial point that Scheherazade surprisingly breaks the cruel cycle of fate which seems to await her. By not quite finishing her story, she leaves the Sultan begging for more. But royal duties call. He cannot hear the rest of her adventurous yarn now. The sentence will be postponed. Tonight, she must conclude her tale. That evening, when Scheherazade finishes her story, she immediately begins another, drawing on characters from the original plot. Amazingly, her royal husband again spares her life so that he may hear the continuation of the tale on the following night. The clever device of having one story grow out of the previous one continues for an uncanny 1001 nights. Eventually, the Sultan abolishes the law calling for the death of his wife. It is a phenomenal accomplishment, assuring Scheherazade of her life and finally freeing the nation from the terrible decree. For this, the name of Scheherazade would echo through the centuries.
It would take a woman of extraordinary abilities to heal this man of his murderous sentiments and his distrust of women. So it may be that Scheherazade's story is a tribute to all of the women who have found ways behind the scenes to get more power and more safety than their culture actually had assigned to them in the first place.
Through Scheherazade, the Western world was introduced to some of the best-loved adventure stories of all time. Many have become classics and are as popular now as when they were first told. Set in locations as diverse as India, Egypt, China, Persia, and Africa, the tales in the Arabian Nights contain a rich assortment of larger-than-life characters who often struggle against immense odds. Mythological beasts and monsters, supernatural beings, magical objects, and feats of great courage are peppered throughout the stories. Many of them have a moral underpinning, containing a profound message of hope. The tales may originally have been intended for use by professional storytellers in the village bazaar or marketplace throughout the early Arab-speaking world.
For people in medieval, Islamic countries, the things that they would like to hear about are the same as for us. They are the fantastic, the exotic, something which is different from their own daily lives. And it even helps if some of the central characters are characters that are recognizable to them from their daily lives and yet get wrapped up in a world of marvels and fabulous events that can, in some sense, lead us out of our lives, our daily grind, and entertain us.
But who was Scheherazade, the extraordinary woman of whom so little is known? Was she merely the daughter of a sultan's vizier who lived in some long-forgotten corner of Arabia over 1,000 years ago? Or, as some believe, was she herself as fictitious as the characters she described in her stories?
I'd love to think there was a Scheherazade. If there hadn't been one, we'd have to invent her. I think in some ways she's a representation of all of the women storytellers whose names we've never heard. We often say that Anonymous was a woman. But in fact, the ancient world has traditions of women storytellers. So Scheherazade is simply the latest in a long line of skilled women performers.
We may never know the answer to the riddle of Scheherazade's true identity. But if she was merely another character conjured up by the real author of the Arabian Nights, who was responsible for the stories? And where did the ideas come from? Did the original writer possess one of history's most imaginative minds? Or were the tales based on real events from a long-gone era? The Arabian Nights tells us that the young bride Scheherazade enthralls her royal husband, the Sultan, for 1,001 nights with her remarkable talent as a storyteller. Yet scholars now believe that the Arabian Nights did not stem from one source, but from many. However, someone must have compiled the stories. Whoever it was is believed to have lived in Baghdad around the 8th or 9th centuries.
The reason there's no authorship specifically to the Arabian Nights is because they are ancient stories. they are ones which are set down from various different collections. Also, a great many of the tales were written in different courts. Some were Persian stories, some were Chinese stories, some were Arabic or North African, or even a few European stories shuffled their way on in, and people rewrote them to the local taste.
One of the easiest ways to understand the compilation of the Arabian Nights is simply to follow the trade routes. We know that the trade routes went to India. We know they went down into Persia. We know they went up into Syria and Turkey and over to Egypt. So there's a lot of cross-breeding of cultural motifs going on. People tend to tell the same stories over and over, sometimes changing the name and some details, but the patterns remain the same.
Whatever their mysterious origin, the stories that have journeyed down to us through the centuries have firmly established themselves as some of the best-loved tales in literature. Perhaps none more so than the story of Aladdin and his wonderful lamp. Set in China, it tells of a poor tailor who meets an evil sorcerer. The sorcerer tricks Aladdin into venturing deep into a dangerous cave where he is to retrieve a brass lamp. But this is no ordinary lamp. It has magical properties and contains a genie or supernatural being with the power to make any wish come true. Aladdin disappoints the sorcerer by keeping the lamp for himself and escaping from the cave. Aided by the genie, he acquires great wealth. He marries the local sultan's daughter and commands the genie to construct a wondrous palace for them. But the wicked sorcerer tracks Aladdin down. Disguised as an itinerant trader, the sorcerer recovers the magic lamp by offering new lamps for old. He commands the genie to banish Aladdin's princess wife and her palace to Africa. But Aladdin pursues the sorcerer, regains the lamp, and reestablishes his palace and his wife back in China. There he prospers and lives a full and happy life. One of the most alluring elements in the adventure is undoubtedly that of the magic lamp. Could it perhaps have served some sort of symbolic purpose in the story?
For ancient people who live without streetlights, who are dependent on the moon for their light at night, a lamp is a symbol of deliverance from darkness. It's a primary symbol of technology. It is, in fact, a helper. It helps you see where you're going. It helps you know where you are. So a lamp makes a perfect magical object.
Aladdin took the lamp and rubbed it gently on its side. Once more the magically appeared, saying, "What wouldst thou command of me, O master? I am ready to obey thee as thy slave and servant." The story of Aladdin and his wonderful lamp.
Far more wondrous than the lamp itself was the jinn, or genie, who lived within it. The origin of this unearthly being comes not so much from ancient legends, but from Islamic religious beliefs.
Within the Judeo-Christian tradition, of course, we find that there are angels and there are devils. And in the Islamic tradition, there are not only the ranks of angels and the ranks of devils that existed in the earlier Judeo-Christian tradition, but also the jinn, or what we say in English, the genies.
The Quran, the holy book of Islam, makes direct reference to the jinn.
We created man from clay, from mud molded into shape, and the jinn race we created from fire and from scorching wind. The Holy Quran, Surah 15, verse 27.
With the genie's help, Aladdin rises to the pinnacle of success. The story contains a profound moral message, perhaps aimed at an audience living in submission to a harsh ruler.
In traditional societies, or in societies that have a rigid social ranking, you need a kind of rags to riches tale to give people hope, because there simply wasn't much room for self-betterment. And this is the whole point of a folk tale. It's to take you from your original state, to take you through many adventures, to bring you back to where you become the head of your own family, and now you have some wisdom about the ways of the world.
The story of Aladdin has firmly embedded itself in Western literary tradition, but it is only one of many cherished tales attributed to Scheherazade. Of all the tales contained in the Arabian Nights, one of the most popular continues to be that of the intrepid sailor known as Sinbad. The story tells of a daring young merchant from Baghdad who undertakes 7 ocean voyages that embroil him in various adventures and expose him to great danger. His travels take him thousands of miles across the Indian Ocean to destinations as diverse as China and Africa. On his first voyage, Sinbad mistakes the back of a large whale for an island. Leaving the ship to frolic on it, he is marooned at sea when the whale dives underwater. On his second and fifth voyages, he encounters giant birds known as rocs, one of which carries him from a valley littered with diamonds and infested by huge man-eating serpents. Always returning home safely, yet always thirsting for more hazardous exploits, Sinbad eventually settles down in Baghdad, but only after he has undertaken a journey to Serendib, the island known today as Sri Lanka. There he is sold into slavery and observes herds of terrifying wild animals. Though an obvious work of fiction, moments of the Sinbad stories seem to ring true. Were these escapades of adventurous daring-do perhaps partly based on fact?
Of all his tales in The 1001 Nights, probably the adventures of Sinbad the Sailor are most closely rooted in real experience by real individuals. I mean, these sailors saw many spectacular things, the types of things that anybody would marvel at. And in bringing them back home 2 years later after a long voyage, of course, and retelling them to families in Iraq or in Oman or in the Arabian Peninsula, of course, they would grow quite naturally in the telling as they spread through society.
The rhinoceros fought the elephant and ran its horn into the elephant's belly, then carried it off upon his head. But the blood and fat of the elephant ran into the eyes of the rhinoceros, making him blind, and he fell to the ground. Then, from out of the sky, came the roc, the giant bird, which carried off both beasts in her claws as food for her young. The second voyage of Sinbad the Sailor.
Could such far-fetched descriptions of elephants and rhinos have been based on actual events? Far-fetched as they seem, the stories may begin in the bedrock of truth.
If you look at the Indian Ocean, it really wasn't that far away from New Guinea and New Zealand. And you know, until recently, we still have the skeletons. There was the giant moa there, which was, you know, not able to fly and couldn't carry off elephants, but could certainly kill a man and was big enough for that. And they were around, living at the time that the Arabian Nights were written. So if a traveler to those far lands had blown off course, gotten to the island where, you know, these giant birds were running around, well, goes back and says, yes, and there were the giant birds that were big enough to eat a man. Well, not quite eat a man, but certainly kill him. Later on, other storytellers get a hold of it and going, wouldn't the bird be more impressive if it carried off an elephant in its claws? Good, we're going to put that. Suddenly, they get more coins thrown into the basket in the marketplace.
أيوة زيد شوية ولكن ما بانتش الفلوس إيدك متقوبة تصورتي الفلوس.
In addition to stories brought back to the village marketplace by sailors and merchants, many tales came to Arabia by way of the great trade route known as the Silk Road. This 2,500-mile-long economic highway, established to carry Chinese silk deep into the heart of the once mighty Roman Empire, linked Europe and Asia for centuries. 1,000 years ago, as commerce increased between the two continents, many merchants made use of it, though it was a grueling journey, often requiring months to complete.
The Silk Route went throughout the ancient world, and there were the caravanserais, where people stopped for the night and closed the doors against desert storms that came by. And sometimes people were trapped there for a few days, which, if you've ever been stranded while traveling, gets very boring, or even when you stop for the night. And so, of course, you're going to do storytelling. Stories were a way to pass the time when there was nothing else to do. So a tale that was told in China would be carried along to Damascus. A tale that was told in Damascus could easily be taken along up into Europe, into Italy, or into North Africa. Travelers go everywhere, and if it's a good story, people will tell it again and again and again.
Like so many of the tales in the Arabian Nights, the saga of Sinbad the Sailor was probably carried across oceans and centuries until the book's original compiler added it to the collection of stories. Today, it remains one of the best-known adventures in the book. A 1,000 years ago, Baghdad was the undisputed cultural and economic center of the Muslim world. This was a time of splendor, of kings and courtiers with their entourages of wives and concubines, living elegant lifestyles in magnificent palaces. It was also a time of bitter feuds and rivalries between royal households. Not far beyond the opulence and luxury lay the constant threat of battle. The common man and woman were often helplessly swept up in the tide of war. This was the turbulent background that spawned many of the tales in the Arabian Nights.
People certainly did live through times where, empires clashed and your country could be ruled by one empire one day and then another empire another, or that the person who is ruling today might be toppled or executed by another figure or a superior and simply be gone tomorrow. So there are all sorts of things that are happening in the world. Elements in the folktale are part of the way societies come to grips with that.
One of the functions of the Arabian Nights may have been to help people cope with the uncertainties of the time. The means to escape hardship has universal appeal, even now. The flying carpet, one of the most mysterious motifs in many of the stories, may have provided the source.
But why is this carpet so exorbitantly expensive? Inquired Prince Hussein of the merchant. Ah, good sir, replied the merchant, this is no ordinary carpet. Whoever possesses it and sits on it may be transported in an instant wherever he desires to be, without hindrance or obstacle. The story of Prince Ahmed.
One of the things we often see in folklore is the notion of magical transference, the idea of traveling quickly. Because for traditional peoples, travel is hard and difficult. I mean, you're very lucky if you have a camel or a donkey. So getting anywhere rapidly seems to them to be miraculous. So probably the magic carpet motif takes an everyday item that people walked on, they know it, they're familiar with it, and yet they imbue it with the magical ability to take you quickly wherever your heart desires. This must have seemed wondrous to ancient people. So the flying carpet may serve a real yearning of the human spirit, both for travel and for freedom from a rigid socio-economic ranked society that didn't give people very much leeway in which to live their lives.
Magic was an integral component in all the stories of the Arabian Nights. Third of the most famous adventures in the book is that of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. Set in Persia, the story tells of Ali Baba and his brother Qasim. One day, they secretly observe 40 thieves gaining entry into a hidden cave. Its mouth is revealed when the thieves call out the magic words, "Open Sesame." Later, Ali Baba returns on his own to the site, utters the password, and enters the cave, only to discover that it is full of stolen treasure. He mistakenly tells his brother about it, who goes to the cave, calls out "Open Sesame," enters it, then forgets the password. He's trapped within. When the thieves return, they find him and kill him. Ali Baba later discovers his brother's body in the cave and brings it back to town for burial. There, the thieves discover where Ali Baba lives. Intent on murdering him in order to preserve the secret whereabouts of their cave, they disguise themselves and visit Ali Baba at his house. But his faithful servant discovers their identity and kills them with boiling oil. Spared from death, Ali Baba uses the treasure from the cave to ensure a long and comfortable life for himself, his family, and his servants. As in many of the stories, in the end, crime does not pay. Good triumphs over evil.
The stories are filled with symbols and metaphors. And particularly in an oral culture, and a culture where knowledge is really being transmitted from generation to generation, and morals and ethics are being inculcated in young people in the form of stories, it's those symbols and metaphors that resonate and give us the deeper meanings of this story.
For all its moral values, the Arabian Nights remains an enigma. Though attributed to the Sultan's young bride, known to us only as Scheherazade, she too is really little more than another character in the book. Who then compiled the stories as we know them today? When we return, a chance encounter at an 18th century French dinner party forever influences the way the world will remember the Arabian Nights. For countless centuries now, the world has enjoyed the stories that were supposedly told by the young bride Scheherazade to her husband, the Sultan. For 1,001 nights, she spun tale after tale in order to save her life from a decree that would have sent her to her death. We may never know whether there was a single compiler of the Arabian Nights, or whether the stories were simply culled from legends and folktales accumulated throughout Asia and the Middle East. But one thing is certain: somebody, somewhere, gathered the stories and wove them together as a single manuscript. Whoever that was may forever remain forgotten. But at the beginning of the 18th century, the Arabian Nights made its first appearance in Western Europe. The place was Paris. Antoine Galland was a student of classical and Middle Eastern languages. He had spent some time working as an interpreter for the French government in Ottoman Turkey. There, he developed an interest in Muslim culture. Before his return to France, Galland purchased a 13th century Arabic manuscript from a dealer in Syria. Its author was unknown, but the work was entitled The 1001 Nights. To this day, it remains the oldest known version of the Arabian Nights collection. Recognizing the unique literary value of the 4-volume set, Galland immediately set about translating the texts. But scholars often wonder whether these were the only documents he worked from.
At one point in his journal, he writes that he is busy translating the 4 volumes of the 1001 Nights. But in a personal letter to a friend, he mentions the fact that he's writing a translation of the 5 volumes of the 1001 Nights that have just reached him from the Ottoman Empire. And then finally, when he dies, among his personal effects, we find only 3 volumes. And so one of the great mysteries of the 1001 Nights is whether there were other volumes of the 1001 Nights that Galland was working from that we have never uncovered.
With the appearance of Antoine Galland's translation, the public fell in love with the stories, though Aladdin, Sinbad, and Ali Baba were still not among them. However, the publishers were soon demanding that Galland provide more material for an expanded version of the book. And it is then that a mysterious character entered Galland's life, a character who would greatly influence the Arabian Nights.
And this is a Maronite priest from Syria named Hanna Diab, who is visiting Paris and who Antoine Galland meets at dinner parties in the houses of French noblemen. And at these evening gatherings, Hanna Diab finds that he can be very entertaining and the center of attention by telling versions of Arabic folk tales as dinner conversation. Now, Galland had heard a number of these tales at parties that he had attended, and we know this because he scribbled them into his diary. And it's among these stories that we find the most famous tales from the 1001 Nights, the story of Aladdin and the story of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. The tales of Sinbad the Sailor, which had never been part of the collection before.
And so it was that 3 unrelated tales have become the best remembered and most popular of all the stories in the Arabian Nights. While the Syrian texts used by Antoine Galland were the oldest ever found, other manuscripts of the Arabian Nights were later discovered in Egypt. Also of unknown origin, they were of more recent vintage, yet in many ways similar to the earlier Syrian texts. Various translators worked from them, and a number of English versions of the stories eventually appeared. But of all the English translations, none became as famous, nor as contentious, as that published by Sir Richard Burton. Already a flamboyant social figure in Victorian England, Burton was renowned as a travel writer and explorer. He had made a name for himself by seeking out the source of the River Nile in Africa. He had visited India and Arabia and had written extensively about them. He had been appointed British consul in Italy, Brazil, and Syria, became a formidable linguist, and was fluent in Arabic. Regarding himself as an expert in human sexual behavior, he had already published English versions of the ancient Oriental erotic texts, the Kama Sutra, and the Perfumed Garden. In the early 1880s, he decided to turn his attention to translating the Arabian Nights into English. For a time, this would become the most popular of all the early English versions, but it was not without controversy.
Basically, Burton took the opportunity to eroticize the text in any way possible. And he added detailed descriptions to anything that might have been simply a romantic encounter, leaving absolutely nothing to the imagination. In essence, Richard Burton took the 1001 Nights and turned it into a piece of Victorian pornography, and it was very popular.
In time, the story of Scheherazade and the Arabian Nights would become one of the best loved of all literary works throughout Europe. Even today, in its native Middle East or wherever stories are told, the essence of the tales still remains popular.
The reason that the Arabian Nights and the full cycle of the tales have remained so popular throughout time is they're very good stories. They have all of the wonders in them which the storytellers could weave in.
Visit the once forbidden land of Tibet, high in the Himalayas on a search for an earthly paradise. Did Adolf Hitler send an expedition here looking for a legendary race of supermen with strange occult powers? The Himalayas, the rooftop of the world, a mountain fortress protecting the remote land of Tibet. A nation closed to outsiders for centuries, leading many to speculate about what astonishing secrets this desolate place might hide.
Welcome to Shangri-La.
In the 1930s, the book and movie Lost Horizon captured the imaginations of audiences across the world and brought a new word to the English language, a term for an earthly paradise, Shangri-La. For centuries, explorers from around the world have searched for a utopian community hidden somewhere in Asia, isolated from the corruption of civilization. In Tibet, such a secret utopian community may be more than just a fantasy. Shangri-La may be based on a heritage of customs and traditions of a legendary paradise called Shambhala, located here in the most isolated, the most inaccessible part of the world. The concept of such a paradise, or Shangri-La, is one of mankind's oldest dreams.
The Tibetan name for Tibet is the land of eternal snow. The great mountains of Tibet are staggering when you see them. It is easy to imagine that they lead to a utopian paradise, that they connect heaven and earth.
Tibet has been the destination for a handful of intrepid explorers lured by the promise of a hidden paradise. They were determined to discover whether the object of their obsession was merely a romantic fantasy or a real place lying just beyond the next mountain. The search would attract explorers and mystics, archaeologists and artists, all daring to infiltrate a nation that had closed its borders to the outside world. Legend held that here, in the Himalayas, there lived a race of spiritual supermen whose knowledge and powers exceeded those known to Western science. In the early 20th century, that belief was spread by an occult religious movement, the Theosophists. One Theosophist became so enraptured with this concept that he mounted an expedition to search for Shangri-La.
This is the Roerich expedition, which set out from America to climb the King Alexander III mountains, which ring a territory whose customs and people had never been recorded pictorially.
He was Nicholas Roerich, a Russian-born artist, and his efforts to locate Shambhala would eventually result in his nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize.
Nicholas Roerich believed that the physical realm of Shambhala was hidden deep in the Himalayas. And when he arrived in the Himalayas, it was all that he hoped it would be.
Into the forbidden city of Lhasa comes the expedition.
The colors, the light, the mountains themselves, they were both exquisitely beautiful to him and spiritually very meaningful.
Roerich was no dilettante, both scientific and spiritual. For 3 years, from 1925 to 1928, the Roerich expedition explored Tibet and the heart of Asia. They endured terrible hardships in the harsh winters. 5 people died. The expedition covered more than 15,000 miles and crossed the highest mountain passes in the world. The expedition traveled under 2 flags, the Stars and Stripes and the banner of Shambhala.
All through Roerich's trek, he raised over his tent the banner of Shambhala, which was a Tibetan tanka. Tanka is a Tibetan painting on silk, and he raised it over his tents because it was some kind of a spiritual protection, perhaps, or a hope.
Roerich painted what he saw, often visions of Shambhala, inspired by his research and interviews.
There's one painting that Nicholas Roerich did called Burning of Darkness. And in it, he depicts a group of men emerging from the mountains. The first is carrying a box from which emanates a blue flame, and this blue saturates the entire painting.
Some scholars speculate that these men were the Mahatmas, masters of Shambhala. Roerich wrote about his experiences in a book called Shambhala, In Search of the New Era.
It remains a mystery whether Roerich actually found Shambhala, the physical Shambhala. However, there are certain indications that he believed he did. He apparently brought a letter written by the Mahatmas to the commissars of Soviet Russia when he visited Soviet Russia in 1926. How he received this letter, who wrote it, how it came into his hands, was it given to him directly by people he felt were genuine Mahatmas? We do not know.
He never announced that he had actually discovered Shambhala, except in a mystic, visionary sense. He read of the legends, he read the Tibetans' books about their voyages, spiritual voyages to Shambhala, and inspired by those, he described Shambhala to a Western audience.
When he returned to civilization, he did so with renewed calling. His was a cause that would gain influential followers and lead to a secret mission for the American government. Roerich set out to create an international treaty by which the nations of the world would respect and preserve cultural treasures, like the Potala Palace, in times of war. They would be protected under the banner of peace, 3 red spheres surrounded by a red circle on a white field, a design Roerich had repeatedly seen in Tibet on rock paintings and banners. The Roerich Pact gained the support of political leaders, including Henry Wallace, the Secretary of Agriculture in Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal administration. Wallace arranged for the treaty to be signed by 21 countries at the White House under FDR's watchful eye. He sent Roerich back to Central Asia in 1935, ostensibly looking for drought-resistant grasses. But we now know he also had a second clandestine assignment.
Of course, Roerich's mission was not only to find these grasses, but to search for Shambhala.
One footnote. When Wallace ran for president as an independent candidate in 1948, the release of his letters to Roerich beginning, "Dear Guru," destroyed his credibility with voters, and Wallace's campaign was through. In 1935, at the time of Roerich's mission, the Great Depression gripped the country. People yearned for a utopian solution to the hard times. With war clouds on the horizon in Europe, the release of the movie Lost Horizon by director Frank Capra, based on the book by James Hilton, captured the hearts of a generation.
It comes as no surprise to me that James Hilton chose Tibet as the setting for Lost Horizons because of Tibet's mystery, its extraordinary beauty, its towering mountains, its desolate plateaus, its endless skies.
Lost Horizons describes a person who is lost in an airplane crash and finds a hidden valley filled with magical who have the power of immortality and who have a sane and a peaceful and a spiritual society. And as long as you stay there, you do not age.
200 years ago. You're still alive, Father Barrow.
In the movie, Ronald Colman plays Conway, a sensitive British diplomat who is groomed to be the successor. But he is forced to leave to protect his brother, who has fallen in love with an exotic girl from Shangri-La.
It's all your fault. It was all arranged until he spoke to you. Why can't you leave us alone?
But the girl has lied about her age. In a horrifying sequence, the girl withers, growing old and dying before our eyes. The phenomenal impact of the movie inspired Roosevelt to name the presidential retreat Shangri-La. But while the benign message of Lost Horizons struck a chord in the West, other, more sinister forces were at work. On his expedition, Nicholas Roerich heard of a subterranean paradise called Agartha, with Shambhala as its capital. Agartha supposedly had tunnels penetrating hundreds of miles through the Earth's crust, and was said to be inhabited by a race of supermen who possessed occult powers. But this was 1935, and none other than Adolf Hitler himself was intrigued by Agartha and its race of supermen.
Who knows why he was looking for Shangri-La, probably looking for it, hoping that he'd find these learned, advanced people and that they were all Aryan or something.
Hitler is said to have sent expeditions to search in European mines for the entrance to Agartha, and Nazi alpine specialists were reported on isolated peaks in Tibet. But Westerners could not bring back proof of Shangri-La. Here in Tibet, the legend of a hidden paradise dates back almost 800 years before the birth of Christ, when it was introduced by a prince from India, the Buddha. He called it Shambhala. A number of ancient Buddhist books allude to the location of Shambhala, describing it as a magical kingdom hidden among snow-capped mountains far to the north. Yet some of them point to the Tian Shan region, to the west of the Gobi Desert. The isolated Tian Shan region described in the guidebooks is not far from this place, Dunhuang, a Chinese site that is the center of a remarkable archaeological find. Hundreds of caves and grottos are carved into these sandstone cliffs. Called the Cave of 1,000 Buddhas, it is a sanctuary that is nearly 1,600 years old. The interiors of the caves are elaborately decorated with Buddhist paintings and statues that may be depictions of Shambhala. In 1900, a Taoist monk exploring the caves unlocked a secret passage to a room full of Buddhist manuscripts, paintings, and books. Among them is one believed to be one of the oldest books in the world, dating to the year 868. These manuscripts hold secrets never before seen by modern man. Perhaps they are the source of the legend of Shambhala. Scholars have spent years attempting to decipher the texts, some of them in languages that are completely unknown. A few have speculated that the caves hide the entrances to tunnels leading to the underground paradise called Agartha.
Imagine yourself traversing this place. The wind's blowing. There's no greenery to be seen. They're jagged rocks. And then coming suddenly upon a place where there is greenery, where human beings relate to each other without fear. This would be Shambhala.
According to the sacred books, the kingdom's inhabitants live in peace, free of crime and hunger, in an earthly paradise of incomparable beauty. But why here, in this far-off, inhospitable part of the world? Perhaps one answer lies in the harsh landscape itself, where humans are humbled by the grandeur of the mountainous panorama.
An ordinary being perceives a place of suffering, dry, barren, rock. An enlightened being sees that place as it really is. The world doesn't change, only our perceptions of it change. Hence, some people see ordinary dry desert, other people see Shambhala.
And given that it is in the heart of Asia, it is not surprising that people would imagine that in that area would be paradises, special magic lands, that wizards and angels would hide secret refuges there for people fleeing the normal human problems.
A nomadic people, the Tibetans know the inner meaning of an impermanent existence. At altitudes of 14,000 feet, every breath can be a moment of contemplation. When the Buddha's words of love and compassion first reached this place in the 7th century, the Tibetans were a fierce tribe. Over the next 1,000 years, while they conquered their many enemies, the practice of Buddhism became deeply rooted. And then the Tibetans did something unique in the history of human civilization. They exchanged weapons of destruction for monasteries of enlightenment. By the dawn of the 20th century, there were over 6,000 monasteries in Tibet, sheltering more than a quarter of the population of the entire country, who devoted their lives to the search for inner peace.
In all of Europe, at the height of the Middle Ages, there were only 2,000 monasteries. So imagine a small country of 8 million people sustaining 6,000 monasteries, some of them with thousands of monks.
For centuries, behind the closed doors of Tibet's ancient monasteries, it is speculated that the secret location of a hidden paradise may have been passed on from one generation of monks and lamas to the next. When asked, the monks always said Shambhala was located to the north. But how could that be? To the north lay mountains never conquered, never crossed. If the passage to Shambhala was so treacherous that it was physically inaccessible, then how would the Tibetans have gotten there?
The way they voyaged was through out-of-body journeying. The Tibetan science of mental control is so sophisticated that Tibetan adepts have learned to control their mind during dreams and to travel in what they call a dream body to other places, to speak with people, to interact with them, to be in those places, while their physical body remains at home in their bed. So through this mode of travel, the Tibetans went to Shambhala, reported on it, and wrote books about what it was like.
Whether or not it actually exists or ever did exist, Shambhala has had a significant influence on the culture and history of Tibet. Today, confirmation of the faith of the Tibetan people can be found everywhere. Prayer flags fluttering in the wind are universal in Tibet. So long as they are moving, they make prayers for the benefit of those who put them up. The faithful walk, always turning a small handheld prayer wheel filled with minute prayers printed on thin paper, or turning larger prayer wheels revolving with literally tons of paper prayers. Could Shambhala be found through prayer and meditation? There may be clues here in one of the most sacred sites in Tibet, the Potala Palace, for centuries the monumental home to the god kings the Tibetans call the Dalai Lama. The holy city of Lhasa, at an altitude of 12,000 feet, is called the Place of the Gods. The white walls and glimmering gold roofs of the Potala Palace appear to grow out of the sheer cliffs. Myriad windows shine like 1,000 eyes along the enormous perimeter of the Potala. What wisdom lies hidden within the sacred walls of this magnificent structure? Does it contain evidence of the lost paradise of Shambhala?
So the Tibetans believe that at the heart of the Potala, there is a kind of spiritual, ritual, magical machinery of maintaining contact with the force of Shambhala, which is the force of the time machine Buddha. The monks of the Potala were specially trained in spiritual dances that were believed to bring the best out in the spirits of nature and the spirits of the heavens and the spirits of the humans. And every year they do the dances of Shambhala there on the Potala.
According to an ancient legend, the Potala, named after a holy mountain in India, rose magically in a single night, its beauty surely evidence of its divine creation. But history records that the Potala was begun in the 7th century, when a warrior king built a palace on this commanding site overlooking a settlement that goes back more than 1,300 years. Today, the monks are gone. The once great Potala is merely a museum, a poignant reminder of its glorious past. It covers a staggering 130,000 square meters, a labyrinth containing the riches of its own history, rarely seen by outsiders.
Monks who lived in the Potala under the direction of the Dalai Lamas, they maintained the very elaborate and very sophisticated cult of the Wheel of Time Buddha, what I call the Time Machine Buddha, or Kala Chakra Buddha, which is the Buddha that is especially associated with the myth of Shambhala. So the magical connection of the Tibetan civilization with Shambhala is through the rituals and the meditations and the artwork that is done in the Potala.
The Potala was planned by the 5th Dalai Lama. Construction began in 1663, but he didn't live to see the final results. The palace was expanded by his successor and completed after 31 years of arduous labor. A sacred road encircles the buildings. Merely walking along it is said to absolve the mortal from all earthly sins. pilgrims prostrate themselves for its entire length, lasting happiness in their future lives. Deep within the Potala Palace, there are more clues in the search for Shangri-La. On the eastern extension of the 3rd floor, in a room called the Kala Chakra Chapel, there are statues of the 7 kings of Shambhala, and on the walls, murals showing the lineages of Shambhala. One large panel illustrates the final battle between the king of Shambhala and the forces of evil. What was the meaning of this terrifying scene? What was the significance of the 7 kings? If there is one man alive who knows the answers to these questions, one man who knows the secret location of Shambhala, he is the Dalai Lama. Surveying the icy panorama of Tibet, is it possible that Shambhala exists, but we simply can't see it? The Tibetans insist that Shambhala can be located, but only by those with finely tuned metaphysical powers, the enlightened. Tibetan Buddhists believe the Dalai Lama, who guards the secret location of Shambhala, will lead them to enlightenment. They believe this living deity passes the secrets of their faith to a successor through reincarnation, a process that has continued for nearly 1,000 years. In 1933, the 13th Dalai Lama died, and the process began again. The monks of the Potala looked for signs of his reincarnation, and they soon found them. While lying in state in the Potala Palace, the Dalai Lama's head turned to the northeast. Soon, a strange star-shaped fungus appeared in the northeast corner of the shrine. Everywhere, people chanted and prayed that a new Dalai Lama would be found. Tibetans believe in reincarnation, that the soul of every living being is reborn into another body, and that the actions of the soul in this life determine the body it will enter in the next. And so the Tibetans had lost more than their ruler. The nation had lost its soul. Following the signs that pointed to the northeast, the monks extended their search to the farthest, most forbidding corners of this isolated nation. Bands of monks trekked across mountain passes of more than 19,000 feet, desperate to find the reborn soul of the Dalai Lama. Stopping at a sacred lake, the monks prayed and meditated, and a vision appeared in the water. They saw a monastery with roofs of jade green and gold, and a house with turquoise tiles. After 4 years of investigation, searchers in the northeast found the very house and monastery that matched the vision. A family with a small boy lived in the house with turquoise tiles.
The young boy walks over to the leader, reaches under his clothes, and grabs hold of his mala, which is a necklace that looks like this, and says, "That's mine." That mala had indeed belonged to the former Dalai Lama, the 13th Dalai Lama.
But how could they be sure that this boy was the reincarnated Dalai Lama? They gave him a series of tests, asking the child to identify holy objects that had belonged to the dead spiritual leader. According to the monks, he was correct on every one. The search was finally over. In 1939, the child was taken to the capital city of Lhasa, escorted by a caravan of 50 people and 350 horses and mules. He would become the 14th
disposes us to say no, how can we say so with conviction? Just because we haven't seen it doesn't mean it does not exist.
It is their faith that has brought these multitudes here to Ladakh, India, for the conclusion of the Kala Chakra ceremony.
A Tibetan will spend their entire life to be present at a single Kala Chakra initiation ritual. This becomes for them their ticket to Shambhala. In the next life or the life after that, however long it might take, they don't worry about it. They know they'll get there.
At the end, witnesses to the ceremony leave, prepared for the journey to Shambhala. The grains of the mandala are swept into eternity to symbolize the spiritual nature of the journey that lies ahead and honor the impermanence of all things.
To me, Shambhala is really mysterious land. If we accept part of this world, then we have to find through map. You can't find. So it is quite clear. Shambhala not exist on this planet. So then, the conclusion in somewhere in the space, that also I think possible. But I have not much interest in all these things. My main concern or interest is our own beautiful planet, but full of trouble.
Perhaps the legend of Shangri-La endures because of our longing to find a place where pain and suffering cease to exist, the ultimate destination of our journey in search of history.
Here's my hope that we all find our Shangri-La.
Stories from the pages of time. Stories of triumph and tragedy, adventure and achievement, as we go in search of history. Discover the home of ancient prophecy where philosophers and kings came to learn their fate. A shrine so powerful that it influenced the destiny of the Western world. She forecast the future, predicting everything from the outcome of wars to the fidelity of wives. Enduring for over 1,000 years, the oracle at Delphi was said to have foretold the coming of the Trojan War. It was here that the democratic laws of Athens were approved, that Alexander the Great was declared invincible. Even the most uncompromising philosophers believed in the oracle's power.
Plato, Thucydides, and men like that who questioned everything that came in front of them trusted the Delphic oracle to give them the word of the gods.
Plato put an oracle modeled on Delphi in the center of his ideal city. And it was the oracle at Delphi who declared Socrates the wisest of men. The Greeks had many ways of trying to uncover the will of the gods. The flight of birds, the play of fire, even the entrails of animals were all interpreted for divine signs.
One always tries to discover the will of the gods. You do it by omens, right? Thunder on the right means the gods like it. A bird flying in from the right means the gods like it. But at Delphi, one could get it from the mouth of the deity himself, through his priestess.
The word oracle has three meanings. It refers to the priestess who delivered prophecies, to the prophecies themselves, and to the place where the prophecies were made. The Delphic oracle issued prophecies for over 1,000 years. But where did the oracle's clairvoyant power come from? According to Greek myth, Delphi is the exact center of the universe.
The story is that at dawn on a certain day, Zeus sent two eagles flying, one from the east end, one from the west end, and they met right over Delphi. One of the symbols of Delphi is the omphalos, the navel, representing the absolute center of the world.
Another legend tells the story of a Delphi shepherd named Caritas, who discovered a chasm in the ground that emitted odd vapors. When humans inhaled the fumes, they could see the future. The verifiable history of Delphi begins in the 16th century BC, 1,000 years before Delphi would reach its peak. Here, at the lowest strata of these ruins, excavators found evidence of human settlement and also of a sanctuary for the worship of an ancient earth goddess named Gaia. An oracle of Gaia might already have been functioning at this remote time, issuing prophecies from inside this cave, about 7 miles from the current site. In the 10th century BC, Gaia was overthrown by a new and more powerful god brought in by invaders from the north known as Dorians. The new god was called Apollo, god of reason, light, music, and prophecy. This 7th century ivory figure excavated at Delphi is one of the oldest images of Apollo ever found. The legend of the new god's conquest at Delphi is a bloody one. Apollo had to kill an enormous python that guarded the sanctuary for Gaia. In memory of the slain serpent and Gaia, Apollo chose a woman to be his high priestess and named her the Pythia. The first Pythia, also known as the Sibyl, delivered her oracles from this ancient rock. Eventually, Pythia moved indoors into a hut made from laurel. This was the first of 6 temples of Apollo. By the time the first stone temple was built in the 7th century BC, the fame and influence of Delphi had spread throughout the Greek world. Plague, drought, famine, war, and virtually every crisis of state brought supplicants here hoping to speak directly with the gods.
A city-state could not function without consulting Delphi for the founding of colonies, for the establishment of new religions, for changing a religion, changing a law. Delphi had to be consulted. Delphi had to sanction it. If the Delphic sanctuary broke down, so to speak, everything in Greece would have broken down for a while.
Little remains to evoke the splendor and drama of Delphi in its prime. This is the ramp that the Pythia walked up as she entered the temple of Apollo and prepared herself for divination. This, the legendary spring of Castalia, said to carry waters of prophecy in which the Pythia bathed before she spoke. This, the sacred way along which the supplicants walked, once crammed with dazzling sculptures, monuments, and treasures from around the world. Overlooking all, the Sphinx, with its enigmatic smile, fitting symbol for the mystery of Delphi. The oracle wasn't the only reason people came to Delphi. This stadium once held spectacular athletic contests, the Pythian Games, second in prestige only to the Olympics. And this theater, the Theater of Dionysus, was once the site of the first arts festival of the ancient world. Dionysus, god of fertility and wine, was worshipped in Delphi along with Apollo. And every year, the mountains overlooking the shrine echoed with ecstatic secret ceremonies of his female devotees. Originally, the Delphic oracle received visitors just one day a year, February 7th, the birthday of Apollo. But by the 6th century BC, demand was so great that the Pythia answered questions 9 times a year, once a month from February to October. Despite great danger and expense, pilgrims poured in from the far reaches of the ancient world, Turkey, Northern Africa, even as far away as Gaul, modern-day France.
It was so difficult to come to Delphi. For example, if you came from Athens, you needed a month. And you had to cross all these mountains. If you had to come from the sea, please fight against the sea, against this weather, against everything. So you had to think first, should I go there or shouldn't I? It was the purpose of a lifetime to come here.
Not everyone who made the long journey to Delphi got to see the Pythia. A privileged few were guaranteed access as a reward for some extravagant offering or gift. When the island of Chios, for example, presented this once massive altar to Delphi, the priests allowed Chians to go to the front of the line, as this inscription declares. For the rest, the order of consultation was determined by lot. Those unlucky enough to be turned away despite the journey had to wait another month and hope for better luck. Those allowed into the Temple of Apollo were about to experience one of the most dramatic and mysterious encounters of a lifetime. Think good thoughts and well-omened words the priests told them as they led them up the ramp. The first thing they saw inside, inscribed on the wall, was an aphorism attributed to the 7 sages of the ancient world. Know thyself. A startling and crucial piece of advice for those who had come in search of a prophecy. Remarkably, almost nothing factual is known about the women who served as oracles and whose prophecies guided ancient Greece. Innumerable visitors came to Delphi over 1,000 years to receive their visions, yet not a single first-hand account of a meeting with the Pythia has been found. Visual evidence showing the Pythia at work is nearly as scarce. This small drawing from the inside of a cup is the only classical illustration of the Pythia at work. What is known is that the first Delphic oracles were attractive young virgins. One Pythia was either abducted by or ran off with a supplicant. Thereafter, only middle-aged women were chosen, ordinary villagers without inside connections or special gifts.
That's very interesting, because it means that they didn't want anybody of any importance to have this job. Someone with influence, someone with interest, someone well-connected.
The Pythia only worked 9 days a year, but the job of making oracles was uniquely demanding. By the 6th century BC, 3 Pythias were on hand to back each other up on busy days.
It's not just a day's work to be inspired by the god Apollo and to feel Apollo inside of your body and to be speaking out the visions that the god has put into your mind. I think if we try to be a little bit of, have some empathy for the Pythia, we would see that this must have been exhausting work.
Preparation for the job was largely a matter of ritual and psychological suggestion. At dawn, accompanied by 2 priests, the oracle bathed in the legendary spring of Castalia, believed to be a source of divine inspiration. Inside the temple of Apollo, she drank from another spring, also believed to have special powers, and piped into the temple through lion's head spouts. The supplicants, meanwhile, were making preparations of their own. They too bathed in the Castalia, and they performed a ritual to see whether Apollo was in the mood to answer their questions.
The ritual was that you would come leading a goat to the altar, and you'd dump a bucket of ice-cold water on top of your goat. Now, if your goat was normal, then it would shake. And that was the sign, yes, Apollo wanted to answer your question. However, if your goat did not shake, just stood there, that meant Apollo did not want to answer your question. You would take your goat and go home and get no answer that day, and presumably come back next time with a new goat.
By now, the Pythia would have come here, to a small room at the rear of the temple where she made her prophecies. Here was the original Omphalos, representing the navel of the universe. Here too, according to a common view, was a supply of laurel leaves which the Pythia supposedly ate to induce a trance. But apparently laurel was not the source of her inspiration.
Some classicists have gone up to Delphi and have chewed vast quantities of laurel leaves, have not felt inspired a bit, but have got a very sick stomach because there's lots of prussic acid in laurel leaves.
According to another popular scenario, the Pythia's trance came from vapors rising through a cleft in the ground under her seat, the same cleft that the goat herder Caritas once found. When the French excavated Delphi in the 19th century, the famous cleft was one of the first things they looked for, but nothing was found.
Things may have changed. It's a tectonically active part of the world. There are earthquakes, there are landslides, there are tremendous changes to the topography, and it may well be that something that was once there is now no longer there. Today, we can find no specific trace.
Whatever the cause, the Pythia did go into some kind of a trance. When the laurel branch in her hand began to quiver, the supplicants were brought in, accompanied by a priest.
He would serve as your intermediary. And the reports are that the Delphic priest would address your question to the priestess. And in response, you would hear something. And what the content of that something is has always been much debated among scholars.
Until the last century, most scholars believed that the Pythia, under the influence of some kind of drug, shrieked out incomprehensible prophecies. A high priest at her side made sense of her frenzied words, writing down his interpretation of what she said. The Pythia was incoherent and wild. The priest was the real power behind the oracle. It's a plausible view. Delphi was an international crossroads packed with up-to-date information. The priests would have been extremely well informed about the world and able to make accurate and useful prophecies. It's a reassuring view that rationally explains the mystique of Delphi. But now, some hold differing opinions.
The whole notion of the Pythia as a shouting, barking, crazed person seems to be derived from a mistranslation from Greek into Latin of terms used to describe this ecstatic, mantic state. In Greek, the word is mania or mania, and in Latin, this was sometimes translated as insania or vicordia, which means to be insane or mad or frenzied.
Those who are skeptical of how this whole process works can't quite believe that Apollo gave real oracles at Delphi. They think that the priestess screamed or muttered or groaned, and then the priest would interpret her response to you. But there's no evidence for that. The Greek sources would simply indicate that it was an answer from the mouth of the Pythia that you yourself could understand. And that's it. You've received your answer to the question.
One of the most difficult questions that the Pythia ever answered came in the 6th century BC from a rich king who wanted to test the Delphi oracle. Instead, the oracle tested him. Delphi by now was the religious and political center of Greece, a kind of capital city unifying the hundreds of independent city-states that made up the Greek world. It was here that the Greeks, often at war with each other, shared common ground. They came not only to consult the oracle, but to honor their gods, publish peace treaties, and tend one of the symbols of their heritage, the eternal flame.
If for some reason the fire in your city became polluted, if it became corrupted in religious terms, what you did was put out all the fires and go to Delphi and have new, fresh, clean Delphic fire. It's the center point of all fire.
Getting clean Delphic fire was a matter of utmost urgency. A runner named Euchytus collapsed and died after carrying the flame from Delphi to Plataea, a distance of 100 miles in a single day. Obtaining a Delphic prophecy was not without risks. The Pythia could offer clues about the will of the gods, but understanding those clues was crucial. Nothing illustrates this more than the Croesus, king of Lydia, the most powerful nation in Asia Minor. In the 6th century BC, he sent emissaries to all the oracles in Greece and asked each one if they knew what he would be doing in exactly 100 days. It was a test. Croesus wanted to find out which, if any, of the oracles could be trusted. Of all of them, only the Pythia was unfazed.
I know the number of the sands and the measure of the sea. I understand the dumb and hear him that does not speak. The savor of the hard-shelled tortoise, boiled in brass with the flesh of lamb, strikes on my senses.
Unaware of the Pythia, Croesus had, in fact, cut up a tortoise and a lamb and boiled them in a brass cauldron on the 100th day, something he thought no one, not even an oracle, would guess. Convinced of Delphi's power, Croesus sent lavish gifts to the sanctuary, 3 head of cattle for an enormous sacrifice, and a spectacular golden bowl large enough to contain 600 smaller bowls. He even sent his wife's jewelry, all in hopes of getting a favorable reading. Croesus to expand his empire by attacking Persia, and around 550 BC, he came to Delphi to ask the oracle if this was a good idea.
He got back the answer, if you cross the Halys River, a great empire will be destroyed. He thought, great, there's the green light. He went ahead and moved east and attacked the Persian Empire across the Halys River and was soundly beaten. And of course, the fault was his for misinterpreting the oracle, and the great empire to be destroyed was the Lydian, not the Persian.
Taken prisoner by the Persians, Croesus later sent his manacles to Delphi as a reproach to the oracle for misleading him, to which the Pythia supposedly replied,
Croesus has no right to complain. Apollo foretold that he would subvert a great empire. Had he desired to be truly informed, he ought to have inquired whether his own or that of the Persians was meant.
The story of Croesus is a good example of the way the Delphic oracle operated, couching her answers in ambiguity that made it difficult for her ever to be clearly wrong, and conversely, guaranteeing that she would always be right.
If the result is not what you expected, it's your failure to interpret it, not the oracle, which is at fault.
The oracle's ambiguity was not just a clever way of saving face. People often came to Delphi looking for clear-cut, easy answers, for certainty, which they rarely got. The oracle worked by heightening their uncertainty, pushing it to a deeper level, forcing them inward for a key. About 70 years after Croesus, the survival of Athens, indeed the whole history of the Mediterranean, turned on the correct interpretation of an unusually difficult and ambiguous oracle from Delphi. By 480 BC, Persia had become the great power in the Mediterranean and was set to attack Athens with an overwhelming military force. Herodotus put the size of the Persian army at 5 million. Desperate, the Athenians sent 2 emissaries to Delphi for advice. The Pythia's response was chilling.
Why sit you, doomed ones? Fly to the world's end. The headlong god of war, speeding in a Persian chariot, shall bring you low. Rise, haste from the sanctuary, and bow your hearts to grief.
Horrified, the Athenians returned the next day, offering prayers and fronds of laurel to Apollo, and vowing to remain in the temple until the Pythia softened her words. She did, but just barely.
Zeus, the all-seeing, grants to Athene's prayer that the wooden wall only shall not fall, but help you and your children.
It was an enigmatic, faintly hopeful oracle. But what did it mean? What was the wooden wall? Was it the wall around the Acropolis behind which the Athenians should gather to fight the Persians? Or was it a wall of ships? Was Athens' only hope to evacuate the city and fight the Persians at sea? After intense public debate, a majority of the Athenians voted to evacuate. Against incredible odds, they defeated the Persians at sea, a victory that laid the foundation of future empires. Those who incorrectly interpreted the oracle were killed when the Persians sacked Athens and burned the city, including the Acropolis, to the ground.
The Persians destroyed the entire city. But thanks to the Pythia, thanks to the oracle, most of the populace was safe on the island of Salamis, and the combined fleet was victorious.
As a thankful offering, the Greeks sent a golden tripod to Delphi, supported by a column made up of 3 intertwined links. The column was taken to Constantinople in 300 AD, where fragments, including one of the snakeheads, can still be found. The oracle at Delphi received visitors and issued prophecies just 9 days a year. But the shrine of Delphi was intensely busy year-round. Much of the activity revolved around the strange relationship between 2 very different gods, Apollo and Dionysus, both of whom called Delphi home. Both gods were crucial to the oracle. Apollo was the dominant influence, representing reason, harmony, and control. But Dionysus, god of wine and fertility, provided a vital counterpoint.
Both of the gods represent the same thing, and that is know thyself. Whereas through Apollo, you know thyself through introspection, through self-revelation. In Dionysus, you know yourself through the vine. That is, you drink and you go outside yourself. You experience yourself in a way that you wouldn't otherwise.
Apollo ruled from February to October, a 9-month span in which he spoke through the Pythia. Dionysus took over in winter. According to Plutarch, a well-known writer and a high priest at Delphi, the division reflected the nature of man, 3 parts rational, 1 part mystical. Dionysus's female followers were called Maenads, as in mania, and they celebrated his wintry resurrection with fiercely ecstatic and highly secret rites. Every November, 14 young women from Athens would join 14 young women from Delphi. Led by a pipe-playing boy who represented Dionysus, they danced up onto Mount Parnassus, 7 miles high, to the Corycian cave. It was the same cave that Gaia, the original goddess of Delphi, was said to have occupied and used for prophecies 1,000 years before. Dionysian rites revolved around aspects of fertility and sexuality, subjects about which the Greeks were not at all ashamed. On the island of Delos, for example, the worship of sexuality was explicit, and the Maenads were reputed to carry phallic symbols as they climbed, drank, danced, and chanted themselves into a frenzy.
It was real. The women went up on the slopes of Parnassus. It was very rugged, tough terrain, and celebrated the Dionysiac rituals up there, which no doubt included dancing, sacrifice, some drinking, and so on.
At the peak of their excitement, the Maenads would seize wild animals, skin them with their hands, and eat them alive. The savage climax represented a kind of divine union with nature and Dionysus himself. Communing with the gods was not the only reason people made the long journey to Delphi. They also came to see the splendor of Delphi itself. Cities and colonies throughout Greece competed with each other here to display their greatness.
Delphi, in many ways, I think of as a sort of permanent World's Fair, with these pavilions almost set up by rival Greek states, where the states are showing off for the benefit of all the other states of Greece. And so the very best examples of Greek architecture and sculpture would have been seen as you made your way up the winding road to the temple itself.
No less than 27 treasuries were crammed along the sacred way. Small but elegant storehouses like this one from Athens, once brimming with gifts. Very little remains of the wealth that once dazzled here. But in 1939, archaeologists excavated some bits of jewelry that hint at the extravagance.
What's spectacular about it is that it gives us a sense of the lavishness of dedications that were being made in the mid-6th century BC. Most important are the chryselephantine images of Apollo, his twin sister Artemis, and his mother Leto. And this gives us an idea of art which we otherwise just read about in ancient sources.
Only a few random samples remain of the thousands of works of art that once filled this shrine. The most famous, a charioteer pulled from the rubble with pupils and eyelashes intact. Monumental sculptures depicting whole scenes from Greek mythology stood atop the Temple of Apollo. Painting, too, flourished here, including a legendary mural with hundreds of figures so vast and complex, it included instructions for viewing. And music was celebrated as well. This inscription of a hymn to Apollo on the side of the treasury of Athens is a rare example of written music from classical Greece. Scholars are still trying to crack the musical code in hopes of one day playing the ancient hymn. Another attraction at Delphi was the Pythian Games. Begun in 582 BC and held every 4 years, these athletic and artistic contests were second only to the Olympics in popularity and prestige. They featured a full range of sporting events: foot races, javelin, discus, boxing, and a vicious no-holds-barred form of fighting known as pankration. Chariot racing, the wildest and most dangerous sport in the ancient world, was also held here on a track that lies deep beneath these olive groves. The games were extremely popular, attracting tens of thousands of Greeks. Now, alcohol was sometimes a problem. It is forbidden to bring wine beyond the dromos, this inscription on the stadium wall. If one brings any, then one must appease the gods and pay a fine. At Olympia, winners received an olive crown. At Delphi, they were crowned with laurel, the plant sacred to Apollo, and they were allowed to erect statues of themselves commemorating their deeds. A more significant difference, the Pythian Games included artistic contests, musical and dramatic competitions that were, perhaps for the only time in history, every bit as prominent and popular as the sporting events.
You didn't necessarily have to be a great athlete, but you could also be a poet or a singer or a musician and participate in this festival. And this represents different aspects of Apollo, who was thought to enjoy these contests.
This shows the Greek combination of things physical and things intellectual and things artistic, which I think in one way is not a bad way to define Greek culture. It got equal billing.
Not everything about Delphi was admirable and pure. Over the 1,000-year history of Delphi, the women who served as oracles were not always entirely trustworthy. There were occasions, to put it bluntly, when the Pythia took a bribe. In the 5th century BC, A Spartan general paid off the Pythia to give a damning oracle about a rival. When the bribe was disclosed, the Spartan committed suicide, and the Pythia was cast from Delphi in disgrace. The scandal shocked the Greeks, but ultimately it was found that humans, not the gods, were to blame.
Apollo is not considered at fault here, but rather his mouthpiece, the Pythia, was considered at fault. The manipulation is done on the human level, not on the divine level.
A far greater crisis confronted Delphi in 480 BC, when the powerful Persian army prepared to sack the shrine. As priests began to hide precious objects, the Pythia stopped them with an oracle. "Do nothing," she said. "Apollo knows how to protect his property." That night, as the Persians launched their attack, a massive landslide decimated their troops. A few looters somehow made it into the sanctuary. 7 inscriptions on this wall announce rewards for the recovery of stolen treasure. Delphi's long, gradual decline began when King Philip of Macedonia and his son, Alexander the Great, conquered Greece. The Greek cities and colonies that had sent leaders to Delphi for urgent political guidance were now just pieces of a vast empire. Individuals still came to Delphi, but with private, relatively trivial concerns.
They would ask who to marry, if their wife, for example, has another man, or how can they get children, or should they be afraid of something? Very simple things.
The erosion of Delphi was greatly hastened by the Romans, who reduced all of Greece to a Roman province in 147 BC. The Roman general Sulla, needing money for a military campaign, decided to get it by plundering Delphi. His troops began to loot the sanctuary, but stopped when they heard music from an unknown source. Was Apollo protesting the theft? No, Sulla explained. The music was Apollo's way of showing how happy he was to help Rome. With the gods' approval, the Romans stripped the treasuries of gifts that had piled up for centuries. Among other things, they took the enormous golden bowl that King Croesus had sent 500 years before. Too large to carry by horse, it was broken into small pieces and melted in Rome. Another Roman thief was the Emperor Nero, who came to Delphi in 66 AD and liked what he saw so much that he sent 500 of Delphi's best statues back to Rome. The mad dictator also competed in the Pythian Games and was crowned winner in the musical competition. One Roman friend of Delphi was the Emperor Hadrian, a lover of Greek culture who refurbished the shrine and revived the oracle in 132 AD. Once again, 3 Pythias were on call, giving prophecies to a new wave of visitors, mostly tourists from the Roman world. Hadrian himself sent a question to the Pythia, a literary question. Who was the real Homer, the man credited with writing Greece's first great poems? The Pythia's answer was that Homer was none other than the grandson of Ulysses, the legendary hero he wrote about in the Odyssey. Delphi's return to glory was brief. By the 2nd century AD, the oracle was all but silent, displaced by a new religion and a new god. The early Christians, determined to wipe out pagan competitors, denounced Delphi, describing the prophetic trance in nearly pornographic terms as a kind of sexual possession by spirits from hell. A popular image of the Pythia as delirious and wild stems largely from these accounts. Remarkably, there was one final poignant flicker of interest in Delphi. Julian the Apostate, so called because he was the last Roman emperor to oppose Christianity, longed to return to the religion of the Greeks, which he described as an adventure of the soul seeking God. In 362 AD, he sent an emissary to Delphi to see if the oracle could be revived. Pythia was still there, and she gave what proved to be the final oracle, announcing in effect her own demise.
Tell the king the fair-wrought house has fallen. No shelter has Apollo, nor sacred laurel leaves. The fountains now are silent. The voice is stilled.
Delphi was banned by the Christian emperor Theodosius in 394 and destroyed with special ferocity. Not a stone was left standing to recall its greatness or fame. But the mystique of Delphi remained. Michelangelo painted this portrait of the Pythia on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Landslides eventually buried the ruins of Delphi under 20 feet of earth. 4. Landslides eventually buried the ruins of Delphi under 20 feet of earth, and for centuries it was forgotten. It wasn't until the Renaissance that early tourists, guided by ancient accounts, way fountains for the shrine. What they found was a village called Castri, built up on top of a sanctuary. 4 centuries later, French archaeologists at Delphi dug their way beneath Castri and into the past, looking for something deeper than just buried ruins. They were on the trail of a dream, a human dream to know the future. It was a quest that led those first seekers, as it leads us, in search of history. Stories from the pages of time. Stories of triumph and tragedy, adventure and achievement, as we go in search of history. Return to the world's first great center of learning, a place where scholars were kings. Discover a storehouse of ancient wisdom whose greatness could not save it from destruction. The library at Alexandria in ancient Egypt was more than just a library. It was the first world research center. Alexandria invited dignitaries from around the world to study in its library halls. Resident scholars could live, eat, learn, and work with visitors who brought important new information into Alexandria. Apparently, all that is left of the legendary library is this modern excavation called the Serapeum, the secondary structure built when the original library began to overflow with books and people. The Serapeum exists only to tease us with a glimpse of the library's illustrious past.
The amazing thing about the library at Alexandria is that it was the most important place of learning in the ancient world. And we don't know where it was or where it is now. We don't know what it looked like. We don't know the details of what books did it have. We don't know everybody who was there. There's more that we don't know than we do know, yet it was the most important event, perhaps, in the intellectual history of man.
Over 3 million people live in present-day Alexandria, mostly followers of the Islamic faith. The old streets are crowded with shops and apartments built alongside ancient ruins. 130 miles northwest of Cairo, Alexandria is Egypt's second largest city and home to her main port. In the 4th century BC, this fine open harbor and its island of Pharos attracted the illustrious conqueror Alexander the Great. When Alexander founded the city in 332 BC, he chose it for location. The Mediterranean Sea, the island of Pharos, and proximity to the River Nile made for a good naval base. The natural harbor allowed easy access to all the nations in the fast-growing Mediterranean. Widespread trade and other civilizations were accessible. Alexandria was ideally suited to be the world's new center of thought and cultural activity. As Alexander the Great looked out into the empty harbor, he held a clear vision for the sea that would bear his name. But why would a warrior like Alexander care about a library? Long before Alexander entered Egypt, generations of Greeks struggled with the riddles of existence. All things were open for investigation. Athens, Greece, became the intellectual center of the old Greek world. Discourse and debate were respected pastimes. Public speaking produced public scholars who became celebrities. In the 5th and 4th century BC, men like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were working in Athens. They were the popular and controversial policymakers of the day. Their early teachings are the foundation for modern thought. And yet the lives of these early intellectuals intersect with that of one of history's finest generals, Alexander the Great.
The tradition is that Alexander was taught by Aristotle. And Aristotle, of course, was taught by Plato, who in turn was taught by Socrates. Plato and Socrates believed that the senses mislead you, that if you can see it, you shouldn't really believe it. They believed in eternal, unchanging truths, which are known by the mind, not by the senses. Aristotle turned this around. Aristotle said no, nothing enters the mind except through the senses. And he, in turn, taught Alexander the Great.
Alexander was born to King Philip, the ruler of Macedon.
You shouldn't really believe it. They believed in eternal, unchanging truths, which are known by the mind, not by the senses. Aristotle turned this around. Aristotle said no, nothing enters the mind except through the senses. And he, in turn, taught Alexander the Great.
Alexander was born to King Philip, the ruler of Macedon, the most rapidly expanding state in the Greek world. Naturally, King Philip wanted the best tutor in the land for his royal son. So at the age 13, Alexander was turned over to the great philosopher Aristotle. The tutor filled the young warrior with a passionate love of learning.
Educated men are as much superior to uneducated men as the living are to the dead. The fate of empires depends on the education of youth. Aristotle the philosopher, 4th century BC.
Alexander valued knowledge as a tool for power. On his quest to conquer the world a decade later, Alexander carried Aristotle's copy of Homer's Iliad with him into battle. The warrior was also a poet. Leading his massive army across Asia into western India, the gifted young commander inspired admiration. His campaign to fend off Persian rule shot like a spear through the ancient world, winning Alexander the support of armies, kingdoms, and countries. In the fall of 332 BC, Alexander crossed into Egypt early in his world campaign. Egypt, then a Persian province, hailed Alexander as a liberator from Persian oppression. Welcomed as a ruler, Alexander was crowned Pharaoh of Egypt. For almost 3,000 years, Egypt had been ruled by godlike pharaohs. Those ancient pharaohs were the link between their mortal subjects and the gods themselves. Egyptian pharaohs were thought to be gods in life and after death. But Alexander was Greek, not Egyptian. He had no guarantee of an afterlife. And so Alexander the Great groped to find his own immortality. Deep in the desert at Siwa, Alexander sought the oracle of the Hidden One, the great Egyptian god Amun. Legend says Alexander had a spiritual secret, that he was the offspring not of mortal King Philip, but son of the god Amun himself.
He went to Siwa and asked the oracle of God Amun if this was true. And in a dream, he saw that the god Amun embraced his mother. So this was an assurance, a confirmation of the claim. And then he asked his father, God Amun, if he would require him to do anything. And the answer came also in a dream. King, I am God Amun speaking to you. Go and found an illustrious city at the site of the island Faros. He immediately carried this out.
In the dream, the god Amun embraced Alexander's mother, while in reality, Alexander embraced Egypt and founded Alexandria. In 332 BC, he decreed his city would be the center of learning in the known world, a cultural magnet drawing on talent from afar. At the heart of the city would be a teaching institute on which other empires could be built, a warehouse of science and literature. The library would be a self-contained universe of accumulated wisdom. Architects laid out the plans for the new city. But after only 6 months in Egypt, Alexander left to continue his aggressive adventures elsewhere. It seemed as though he would conquer the world. But in 323 BC, weakened by wounds and fever, possibly poisoned, Alexander the Great suddenly died. What would happen to his dream city? Would new rulers share Alexander's lust for knowledge? The library at Alexandria had yet to be built when its mentor died. Would the world ever see his vision? With the founding of Alexandria, a bright new period of Greek history began. It was a dawn of new leadership and a new way of thinking. When Alexander the Great died, his Egyptian kingdom was taken over by Ptolemy, Alexander's most trusted general, who would build the library Alexander envisioned. Ptolemy I started a dynasty, a series of kings from the same family who would rule Egypt for almost 300 years. Ptolemy I made Alexandria the capital of Egypt, but still the city faced powerful competition from ruler generals of other countries.
They competed with one another in power, in wealth, and grandeur. One field of competition was culture. And Ptolemy wanted his city not to be only a capital of a powerful country, but a center of enlightenment, of knowledge, and of learning.
The original Alexandrian citizens were local Egyptians, the Macedonian Guard, a large Jewish community, and Greek immigrants. Thanks to Ptolemy, Alexandria immediately began to attract influential scholars from around the Greek world. Ptolemy I was a man of iron will and intelligence. He surrounded himself with a circle of important men advanced in the fields of literature, philosophy, and science. The architect Demetrius of Phaleron helped Ptolemy lay plans for the new city. Bricks, broken temples, and battered sphinxes lie atop the only surviving portion of the institution. The Serapeum Water Library is thought to have been built inland from the main library and museum. Where was the main part of the structure located? The Library of Alexandria now presents more questions than it does answers.
One of the great mysteries of the Library of Alexandria is where was it? Nobody's sure where it was. We think it was by the water, and that's a good bet for where it is now, under the water. We also don't know what it looked like. There are no contemporary accounts that really give a description of what the library was like. So we really wonder, what did the thing look like? Did it have 2 stories? Did it have 3 stories? Was it dark? Was it well lit? There are a lot of things we don't know about the library.
The main library was probably built close to the harbor in the royal Greek section of Alexandria. It was thought to be in or near the palace called the Bruteion, or museum. Its research was royally funded. Many local scholars were on the king's payroll. The Ptolemies were understandably proud of their library.
There was a strong sense of obligation on the part of the Ptolemies to foster learning, which is remarkable in a way. It is. When their real concerns were with power, security of the dynasty, and the problems of Egypt, which are immense. One of the things Ptolemy did was collect books, a very Greek thing to do. Collect as many books as possible, and he did it with a vengeance.
Visitors arrived with their versions of famous older literary texts. Sometimes agents were sent abroad to bring back new works. On occasion, manuscripts were donated. Even Aristotle's library was willed to the Library of Alexandria.
We are told also that there was a law that any traveler who set sail into the harbor of Alexandria was searched for books. Not for drugs, but for books. And if a book was found, it was taken to the library. If there was no copy of it, it was confiscated and the traveler was compensated. So they did wonderful things in order to acquire books. But the normal method of acquiring books was, of course, by purchasing them. And there were marts and markets for books. So, in this way, Alexandria acquired the largest collection of books ever existed in antiquity.
How many scrolls were eventually contained within the libraries at Alexandria? Ptolemy's goal was to have every existing written work in the Greek world and beyond. The secondary collection, located in the Serapeum, alone was said to hold 300,000 books. But over the course of history, the collection grew even larger.
We don't know how many books there were. The best authority I know of says about 400, 500,000, which is an awfully big library by anybody's standards. But counting books is a very inexact science.
Manuscripts were not just stored away at the Alexandria Library. They were used as research and reference for other, newer scholars. And priceless books were copied by local scribes and traded for books from other parts of the ancient world. Some of the most significant works in history could have been lost forever were it not for scrolls copied in Alexandria.
The main significance of the library and the museum at Alexandria is that it did what a great library does. It did. When you go in and take a book out of the library, you're performing one of the great basic cultural functions, and the library is doing its job.
Each piece had to be cataloged, perhaps cross-referenced, and put away. Librarians had to be able to retrieve the works easily, and scores of new works were constantly pouring in. Along with more material for the library came more visitors. Scholars were drawn to Alexandria, and their presence enhanced its reputation as a cutting-edge center for learning and knowledge. Herophilus, the anatomist, established an in-house medical school at the Bruchion. Before Alexandria, doctors used animals to research human anatomy. Long before anesthetized operations were performed, it was rumored that scientists in Alexandria operated directly on living men. No evidence for this charge exists, but Herophilus was among the first to perform medical examinations on humans after their death.
The Greeks were prohibited from doing dissection by tradition. It was prohibited to cut the human body. It was almost a sacrilege for the Greeks. But on Egyptian soil, you had the tradition of the Egyptian embalmers, who for 3,000 years had been dissecting bodies. So at the medical school in Alexandria, for the first time, physicians could practice on human cadavers. And in Greece, in Athens, for example, there were physicians who often said, I wish I had studied at Alexandria because they could do human dissection. So the library at Alexandria was, in a sense, more free than any other place, especially the medical school, and this was an important feature of it.
Besides literature and medicine, Alexandrian research under the Ptolemies favored mathematics. The founder of geometry, Euclid, lived in Alexandria and published a textbook that replaced all previous efforts. He also opened a school.
The geometry you studied in grade school is, of course, from the Alexandria Library. Euclid, who codified the results of the basic theorems that others had made. And you will still see in an ordinary, everyday paperback introduction to geometry the name of one of the men who worked and studied at the library.
Little is known personally about Euclid, but one legend remains. When Euclid showed the new work to King Ptolemy, the king asked if there was a shortcut to knowledge. Euclid's reply, "There is no royal road to geometry." Ptolemy worked tirelessly to build the library, but as he grew older, he looked to his son to govern the land of the pharaohs. And when Ptolemy died in 283 BC, Ptolemy II became the sole ruler of Egypt. The great Ptolemaic dynasty would continue almost 300 years until Cleopatra's death and leave its indelible mark on the Library of Alexandria. The second Ptolemy fulfilled the wishes of his father and Alexander the Great, and the Library of Alexandria flourished in the 3rd century BC. Ptolemy II ruled with his sister, and under their reign the library and museum grew and prospered. It was the golden age of Alexandria. Besides expanding the library and museum, Ptolemy II built the last of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a mammoth lighthouse on the island of Pharos. Today, the foundation of the ancient lighthouse is buried beneath this comparatively modern Islamic structure, the military fort at Tayet Bay. But in Ptolemaic times, travelers to Alexandria viewed the first architecturally designed lighthouse in history, a 3-tiered marvel of construction over 400 feet tall. It took vast amounts of fuel to fire up the lighthouse. The ancients may have burned animal dung to send a powerful beacon of welcome to the world from Alexandria. Travelers, guided by the lighthouse, were drawn into the library, lured by the treasures in its bounty of scrolls.
The history of Egypt would be typical of the kind of thing that would be in the library. Histories and records and literature would be an example of the kind of records necessary for a scholar to do research with. The difficulty was, of course, that there were 2 languages involved, Egyptian and Greek, but the basic language of the libraries was almost completely Greek, for this was a Greek ruler, a Greek court, a Greek culture imposed on the incredibly old civilization of Egypt.
The library was a storehouse for all types of literature. All the great Greek philosophers must have been represented, including the writings of Diogenes. Diogenes had been inspired by a young peasant who lived in simplicity. Like the young man, Diogenes even discarded his drinking cup in favor of using just his hands. Diogenes then stripped himself of all worldly goods. He gathered a group of like-minded thinkers known as the Cynics and documented their critical views of ancient Greek society. Diogenes believed that no man could be trusted. Legend tells of his lifelong unsuccessful search for an honest man. Diogenes looked all over town in broad daylight with a lantern to prove his cynical point. The manuscripts of Diogenes the Cynic were but a fraction of the library's immense collection.
The library in Alexandria was really unique in an important way. It was eclectic. They wanted everything. It wasn't just Greek culture that they were collecting. They wanted Babylonian texts. They wanted Turkish texts. They wanted everything they could get. They wanted the Hebrew Bible.
According to legend, The earliest Greek translation of the Old Testament was written in Alexandria under the guidance of Ptolemy II. He is said to have requested 70 Jewish scholars to translate and copy simultaneously the Hebrew books of law.
The text was in Hebrew, but in Alexandria there was a great and very large Jewish community. It seemed that that community was very quickly Hellenized, and that Hebrew was no longer comprehensible to them. So a Greek version was required. It was made in Alexandria.
Named for the number of scholars who copied it, the Septuagint made the Old The Bible and all of the books in those ancient times were written on papyrus scrolls. The word paper came from the Egyptian papyrus, the plant from which scrolls were made. Papyrus grew along the banks of the Nile. The ancients pressed wet strips of reeds side by side. They were pounded flat, and when dry, could be written on with pen and ink.
It took a long time for a scribe to finish a book, and I don't think they looked on labor, of course, the way we do. We would go crazy trying to copy another book in longhand on papyrus, but it was a famous profession, and some scribes rose to be important people. Of course, in those days, to be able to read and write was almost magical.
Astrology and astronomy were popular sciences throughout the existence of the library in Alexandria. Many ancients believed in the influence of the stars and planets on daily life.
The belief was, of course, that as above, so below. What happened in the heavens influenced what was on Earth. So astrology was part of astronomy, and astronomers were astrologers, and astrologers were astronomers. In order to predict what happened on Earth, you had to accurately observe what happened above.
In Alexandria, Aristarchus first figured out that the Earth revolves around the stationary sun. About 100 years later, Hipparchus was the first to chart over 1,000 individual stars. He even figured out the length of the solar year correct to within 7 minutes.
The library must have been an exciting place to be at. I mean, this was the closest you had to a government grant, where you could just do what you wanted to do and be supported. In the air was the sense that study everything for its own sake, and just try to put everything together for figuring out the mysteries of the universe.
But while scholars in Alexandria solved the riddles of the mind, the power of the Romans was looming in the east. Would this unique oasis of knowledge be able to survive in an increasingly menacing world? In Alexandria, another Ptolemy was crowned king of Egypt in 246 BC. Ptolemy III was a conqueror. He traveled the world and returned to Alexandria with priceless Egyptian treasures stolen by the Persians 300 years before. This act of restoration earned the third Ptolemy the title of benefactor. Under his reign, the tradition of learning thrived in Alexandria for another generation. About 235 BC, the honored position of chief librarian was filled by Eratosthenes. In keeping with tradition, the influential scholar also served as tutor to the royal family. The 40-year-old scholar was skilled in a variety of subjects, from poetry to science.
Eratosthenes is the first one to figure out the circumference of the Earth. Now, it's important to note, we were all taught in school that Columbus is the one who showed that the Earth was round. Educated Greeks knew that the earth was round well before Columbus. Even in one of Socrates' dialogues, he says, when we describe the earth, we know that it's a sphere suspended in the heavens. So it was known that the earth was round. The question is, how big was it?
By observing shadows cast in Alexandria and in the south of Egypt at noon on the same day, and calculating the difference between the size of each shadow and the distance between the two locations, Eratosthenes was able to figure out the circumference of the earth. He said the earth was 24,650 miles around. Amazingly, he was accurate to within roughly 200 miles. A contemporary of Eratosthenes, called Archimedes, also visited Alexandria. Perhaps the most celebrated of ancient mathematicians, Archimedes studied weights and measures in what we now call physics. Archimedes' principle of water displacement is still referred to today. At the height of its popularity, scores and scores of great minds came through Alexandria. But over time, the luster of the library began to fade. The reign of the fourth Ptolemy marked the beginning of the decline of the dynasty and of the library. Other world centers of knowledge emerged as replacements. Near the Aegean Sea, the library at Pergamum was a rival to Alexandria in culture and splendor. And as the influence of the Romans spread out through the world, even Egypt's great Ptolemaic dynasty came under the threat of Roman rule. In 48 BC, when the Roman general Julius Caesar came to Egypt, the ruler of the land was 19-year-old Queen Cleopatra, perhaps the most famous and fabled of all the Ptolemies. The mythology surrounding Cleopatra begins with her very heritage.
We often think of her as an Egyptian. No, she was a pure-blooded Greek. She was the direct descendant of that Ptolemy who was one of Alexander's field commanders. She was the undoubted pharaoh, the god queen of Egypt. She had high intellect and was quite an extraordinary person by any standards.
Cleopatra faced Julius Caesar without fear. Although Caesar came to conquer Egypt, Cleopatra conquered Caesar's heart instead. At their first meeting, she was said to have emerged naked before him and disarmed the brilliant Roman with her charming manner and political savvy. But beyond her seductive nature, Cleopatra possessed admirable military skills and a keen intelligence.
The important thing is that Cleopatra was really an intellectual. Of all the Ptolemies, Cleopatra was the only one who could speak Egyptian. It was known that she could greet the people who came to her court in their own languages. And probably when Caesar came and when Antony came, she could talk to them in Latin. So Cleopatra would have had an active interest in the library, almost certainly, as an intellectual. There are even traditions that Cleopatra wrote works which might have been in the library.
It was during the reign of Cleopatra that the tide of history first began to turn against the great library at Alexandria. When Cleopatra struggled for rulership of Egypt against her co-ruler and brother, Caesar sided with Cleopatra and found himself embroiled in an Alexandrian civil war. Caesar's navy was no match for the fine Alexandrian vessels, and soon he was surrounded in the harbor.
Caesar found himself encircled, resorted to the use of fire, and he set fire in the enemy's ships. The fire destroyed ships at sea and in the docks. And here, the account of Caesar himself stops. A century later, we have more details that the fire was not limited to the ships, but extended to the closer parts of the city, near to the harbor. And Plutarch, who knew Alexandria very well and who visited Alexandria, says that the fire extended from the docks to the great library of Alexandria.
According to the ancient historian Plutarch, the library was accidentally destroyed by a fire which spread from the harbor. But some modern historians believe that the fire destroyed warehouses containing only a portion of the Alexandrian scroll collection. Did the Library of Alexandria rise from the ashes to continue its tradition of teaching? After Caesar's death in 44 BC, his successor, Mark Antony, offered Queen Cleopatra thousands of books purchased from the rival library at Pergamum. This offering was perhaps made to replace the books burned by Caesar. Mark Antony, like Caesar before him, sided with Cleopatra against the opposition in Alexandria. But in 31 BC, the two were defeated at the sea battle of Actium. Mark Antony committed suicide, and his lover, Queen Cleopatra, soon followed suit. Legend tells us she placed a snake to her breast, and soon after being bitten by the asp, succumbed to its poison and died. More probably, Queen Cleopatra drank a poison which killed her. But whatever the cause, the Ptolemaic dynasty, which had founded and funded the Library of Alexandria, ended with the death of Cleopatra in 30 BC. If the civil war in Alexandria and the demise of a dynasty could not destroy the tremendous library, what could? With the end of Ptolemaic rule in 30 BC, Alexandria became the capital of a Roman province claimed by Julius Caesar's grandnephew, Augustus Caesar, the first Roman emperor. By then, Alexandria was home to more than 300,000 people. The city itself enjoyed a resurgence of energy which had been absent in the last half-century. But under Roman influence, the library did not flourish as it had in the past.
The Romans had a different concept of learning than the Greeks. They weren't into it for its own intellectual enterprise, for the sensuousness of just pure learning, of pure reason. So the Romans, when they come in, they love the trappings, they like being mummified, they love the idea of immortality, but supporting the library is another thing.
But still, the Library of Alexandria continued to produce scholars bent on discovery. Claudius Ptolemy, a Roman of Greek descent, was born around the end of the 1st century AD. He was educated at the library and museum and published books on world geography and science. Using the work of Hipparchus before him, Claudius wrote volumes of works on astronomy and astrology. Claudius promoted the idea that the Earth was the center of the solar system. This became known as the Ptolemaic system of astronomy and was used up through the 16th century.
I know that I am mortal and ephemeral, but when I scan the circling spirals of the stars, no longer do I touch Earth with my feet, but sit with Zeus himself and take my fill of the ambrosial food of the gods. Claudius Ptolemy.
Claudius Ptolemy lived during a relatively peaceful time in Roman history. But by 200 AD, Alexandria faced invasion and plunder from abroad. The most important days of learning and knowledge had passed from the great city forever. The precise cause of the library's ultimate destruction may be lost to time. Accounts from various ancient sources conflict with one another and with modern historians. the subject remains controversial. By 400 AD, paganism was outlawed and Christianity prevailed as the official religion of the Roman Empire. The Emperor Theodosius ordered the destruction of all monuments and temples which did not honor Christianity. Pagan scholars were murdered in the streets. During a time of constant ethnic confrontation and rebellion, the library may have been destroyed by the Christians. In 616, Alexandria was overrun as the Persians conquered Egypt. The same century brought Arab conquerors to the land of the pharaohs, and with it, the Islamic religion of Muhammad. This was perhaps the point in history when the library was finally destroyed.
I think most people today who've studied the problem would say that the real destruction came when the great Muslim army crossed the Delta, took and sacked the city.
Alexandria surrendered to the Arabs, who decreed that if the library's contents contradicted the Islamic faith, the books should be destroyed. And if they supported the Islamic faith, the books were unnecessary and should be destroyed. Legend tells us that the Arab rulers ordered all of the books in the Alexandrian collection to be burned. All of the stories surrounding the decline and destruction of the Alexandrian library combined may provide the truth. Perhaps the great institution died by degrees. Caesar's fire, lack of funding, the Christian Revolution, Muslim invasion, and the damp coastal climate of the fine port city may all have contributed to the loss of the largest collection of scrolls in antiquity. Whatever remained may simply have disintegrated. Perhaps what is important is not how the library disappeared, but that it ever existed.
I think the wonderful thing about the Library of Alexandria is that they did it, that the Ptolemies were willing to support this group of scholars that didn't do anything for the Greek economy. They didn't bring in money. They didn't make any contribution to the Ptolemies' lifestyle, but they still supported it. It was a sense of learning for its own sake, and that's wonderful.
The vast world research centers of today are descendants of the great library of Alexandria. There, 2,000 years ago, scholarship was a magnificent quest, and men of the mind were heroes. It's a legacy that illuminates our path as we go in search of history.